A guy named Sion has various textbooks on a shelf in his apartment. His desk is a mess, a pile of sheets with eraser marks, pens, rulers, notebooks, and drawings. There is also a TV on the table, where the news is on. The anchorwoman tells us that in today's incident, a man named Mo Yan was found dead in his own home. The screen shows a schematic image of the murder, where the intruder kills the victim while she is lying in her own bed. The woman went on to say that the investigation showed that the incident has many similarities to Mo Yan's recent murder. And considering the fact that both murders took place in Incheon, it is highly likely that the cases are somehow related. Sion, lying on his bed, turned off the television with the remote control. On his wall was a large map with various markings and many notations. Sion was lying under a blue blanket on an equally blue pillow. He stared emotionlessly at the bright screen of his smartphone, reading something. At 10:23 a.m., he had received a message that due to too much absenteeism, he, a first-year student from class of the Department of Architecture, would have to attend extra assignments. On the corner of his smartphone hung a cute clover keychain. Sion put his phone away and looked down with a blank stare. He believed that there was absolutely nothing keeping him in this rotting world, and the only thing he believed in was a mysterious place. The clock on his shelf ticked slowly and measuredly. It was 1:25 p.m. on the clock. Sion lay on his back and covered his eyes with a smile. Near his pillow were books, and on top of the books was a gilded compass. The compass hand, which was between north and west, suddenly began to twitch from side to side. Sion began to fall into a deep sleep. A dream in which one realizes that one is currently in is called a conscious dream. The arrow on the compass began to spin randomly, making several rapid full revolutions in succession and glowing bright red. Sion found himself in a dream, holding the compass with the spinning arrow in his hand. He was standing on the roof of a building in a futuristic city, smiling broadly. The guy was wearing a white shirt with a yellow tie, a blue jacket, and black pants. White airships were flying through the sky, the sun shining brightly despite the clouds. He was the hero of this place called Mystic Island. Suddenly, Sion pushed off the roof and soared into the air, rising high above the city. He flew over the city at bird's-eye height, looking around at the many angular and modern buildings. On one of the buildings hung a billboard with him and a frog, probably advertising something. This place allowed him to try out superhuman abilities, and he only needed his own imagination to do so. He smiled widely, his scarlet eyes glittering with anticipation. Sion submerged underwater, finding himself in the blue ocean. He was surrounded by various fish, and a mermaid with long blonde hair swam towards him. They smiled at each other while two mermaids with blue and green hair watched them. Sion liked to create images in his head and meet different mythical races, portraying the place with incredible accuracy and bringing happiness to it. The mermaid and Sion held hands, getting closer and closer to each other. Sion could erect all sorts of buildings by sheer force of will. He found himself already in a city on land. Various sights from all over the world began to appear around him, from Japan, Brazil, France. From Sion's hands came crimson lightning, with the help of which the buildings appeared. Sion himself stood on a tower of many old TV sets of different colors. At the top of the tower were 4 screens that showed his face, and on top of the tower sat a green frog. Airships were flying around, and people were standing below, expressing their love and appreciation for Sion with signs and cheers. Colorful confetti swirled in the air. Sion could even recreate his brand new image in the dream. His face depicted many feelings ranging from joy to pleasure. He jumped off the tower erected in honor of him, leaping onto a nearby building. His cheeks slightly flushed, he looked down and the view seemed to take his breath away. He shouted that this world was his true home. It was a place that he could mold into any shape he wanted. Somewhere in the distance, a mysterious dark ball of purple color with yellow details began to appear. Sion turned his attention to it, dumbfounded for a second. He was sitting on the edge of the roof of the building opposite his tower. That ball was getting closer and closer, leaving behind a black trail in the air. Something was glowing red inside of it. Sion asked himself what that flying balloon was. The guy stood up straight and raised his head, watching the strange object. The orb looked like a dark purple funnel that was mixed with black color inside. Golden details encircled this orb, and from a small hole in the details, a red light source that resembled an eye seemed to be looking at Sion. But somehow, his own dream in which he exists doesn't belong to him. He cried out in surprise and shock that he didn't create something like this, looking apprehensively at the looming object. Suddenly, a multitude of black spider-like legs emerged from the dark ball. On top of the creature appeared a white ball with purple-colored designs on it. They depicted patterns resembling spirals and eyes. The creature's paws instantly began destroying the buildings that Sion had lovingly erected. Concrete debris flew in all directions, raising pillars of dust in the air. The city slowly descended into chaos. Destruction was everywhere, and acrid smoke mixed with dust rose into the air, disturbing airships and balloons. The tower screens began to show static. Parts of the city had already turned into wastelands with the wreckage of buildings made of concrete and metal pins. The rumbling of falling structures didn't stop for a second. Seon glanced anxiously at the view before him. A huge hole had formed in the middle of the vacant lot, among the construction debris and what was left of the houses. The guy didn't understand what had just happened. A droplet of cold sweat ran down his face as he stared into that hole with shock. His lips tightened and his pupils narrowed. He said that none of this made sense and didn't understand how such colossal destruction had appeared without his will. Suddenly, something began to crawl from the hole to the boy's feet. Seon broke away from his thoughts and looked down. He was surrounded by strange limbs resembling snakes. They had an eye in their mouths. One of them grabbed Seon's left leg, putting the guy in a stupor and shock. He didn't realize what was happening. The guy looked at what grabbed his leg and thought it was some strange dark hands. Suddenly more dark hands grabbed him, pulling him down into the hole. Several hands held his leg, while others grabbed at his jacket, which Seon had already managed to slip out of. He began to fall down into the hole with shrill screams as the rest of the limbs aimed at him. Seon gritted his teeth and looked down, trying to see something there while the many limbs watched him with their eyes from their jaws. As he plunged into the darkness, he thought about what was going on and what strange things were going on in his dream. Seon fell into a strange space with cubes of yellow and blue colors resembling cubes from Tetris. He was in a cocoon of these black hands that were dragging him down. Suddenly, the cocoon began to slowly dissolve, becoming covered in green light from the outside. Once the cocoon completely vaporized, it showed Seon sitting inside. The fall had left a small round-shaped crater on the ground. The guy clutched his head with a disgruntled and tired face, covering his eyes. His head ached terribly and he still couldn't understand what had happened to him. Seon started to open his eyes and he didn't realize where he was. He looked around at the place he found himself in, asking himself where he had gotten himself to. His face was full of surprise and incomprehension. All these cubes and blocks were the size of two-story houses, and the walls and ceiling were cages with a picture of the sky and fluffy clouds on them. He realized that wherever he was, it didn't look like he was inside a big dark pit. Seon looked at the blocks hovering in the air and said that this was definitely a dream, but he had no idea which one. He anxiously started to get up off the ground and fix his tie, until a girl ran behind him among those blocks. Seon was just beginning to lament the fact that there was no one around to help him when he suddenly turned around and saw this girl. He let out a questioning cry and looked at her. She was a skinny girl with black, long hair pulled back into a high ponytail. She was dressed in a black and white top and black tight pants. In her hand she held a sword, and behind her back, two other blades hung on a leather belt. Because of the strands that were not tucked into a ponytail, Seon could not see her face. He called out to her, calling her a girl with her hair tied back, and waved at her. He inquired if he could ask her something. The girl turned her attention to him and looked in his direction. She was beautiful. She had large violet eyes, thin black straight eyebrows and a small nose, and her lips were pink and plump. Seon raised his hand in her direction and said in an orderly tone to immediately approach him. She only gave him an emotionless glance. She stared at him, staying where she was while an uncomprehending Seon waited for her to come now. Seon irritatedly looked at her hand and asked himself why she disobeyed him. After all, he had looked her in the eye and clearly said the order. Apparently, he thought that since he was in a dream, he could control all people. The girl started to take steps in his direction. She slowly approached him and Seon started to shake and panic, indicating that she was getting closer. He exhaled relaxed and ran the back of his palm across his forehead. He was already starting to get a little worried, because in his opinion his orders were simply impossible to disobey. Because after all, no one in his dream had their own self-awareness. As the girl walked towards him, he said that he must have created her with poor hearing, or it just takes a long time to reach her. A person who creates images in their dreams can give those images character, demeanor, and other characteristics. Seon looked at her and said that he was going to ask her some questions, and if she knew the answers then let her elaborate. He stood in a smug pose, covering his eyes and rubbing his chin, and said that first of all, he wanted to know where exactly they were. He couldn't recall ever creating a location like that in his dreams, because that wasn't his style at all. And secondly, how did she get here without his permission? He opened one eye and said that he didn't expect much from her, but if she knew the answer to at least one of his two questions, she would be glad. He didn't have time to finish his sentence before a blade was suddenly placed against his neck. Seon clenched his teeth and was very scared. The girl holding her sword at Seon's neck called him very rude. Seon looked at her shockedly, trying not to make any unnecessary movements so as not to collide with the blade. He didn't realize if she was threatening him. The girl furrowed her eyebrows slightly and, still holding the sword, asked Seon what team he was on. He was surprised and said that he didn't understand what the girl meant. The girl had a sullen look on his face and said that apparently he didn't feel like telling anything. She already wanted to show him what would happen in such a case. However, as soon as the blade came close to Seon's caddy, he asked her to stop. He was trembling with fear and sweat was pouring down his face. He couldn't understand what was going on here. He asked himself if he was in his dream, because the girl was supposed to obey him. Seon thought about it and noticed that she stopped as soon as he yelled and asked her to stop. He figured that meant she was obeying him after all. Seon gave the girl a cheeky look with a thumbs up and ordered her to put her sword away and follow all his orders from now on. The girl didn't appreciate such a response and looked at him disdainfully before striking. Seon cried out loudly in pain. After that, the girl started sketching something with a pencil in her notebook. She looked thoughtfully at the sheet and began to recount what Seon had told her. He told her that a dark pit had suddenly appeared and sucked the guy in his own dream, and that's how he ended up here. The girl sat on one of the cubes, and after she finished the retelling, she asked if she had understood everything correctly and showed him a drawing in her notebook. It showed schematically a man falling into a pit. Seon, being frightened, looked at the drawing and said that it was probably like that. She said the command blank, whereupon the notepad and pencil were put away into the black-colored system window that opened. Seon at this time sat meekly on the floor with his legs tucked under him, scratching the back of his head nervously. The girl lowered her gaze thoughtfully and covered her eyes. She asked Seon how he had managed to enter the cube without being checked. Seon didn't understand anything she said, notifying her of this. She opened her eyes and said that she understood the situation, but she didn't understand the result and none of this made sense. Seon nervously told her that he was only telling her the truth. Suddenly from behind, someone was struck by a green beam and flew towards one of the cubic walls, which caught the guy's attention. The person collided with the wall, causing puffs of smoke to appear all around. The man who was struck by the impact screamed in agony with his mouth and eyes wide open. Seon anxiously turned around, looking at what was happening. The girl looked slightly worriedly in the direction of the incident, not commenting on it in any way. A large dent had formed where the man had fallen, causing the blue cube to be destroyed. Two guys ran up to him. One of them was light-skinned. He was wearing a white t-shirt, had a white cap on his head and blue headphones. His left arm had been replaced with a firearm with smoke coming out of it, and various high-tech modifications could be seen on his body. Behind him stood a man with dark skin. He was wearing a black t-shirt and khaki pants. He wore goggles, and behind his back was a huge sword. They both had green-colored armbands on their arms. The guy in the white t-shirt arrogantly said that their opponent could at least dodge, because he might get bored of it if they keep falling from one shot. At the same time, his friend was looking at something on the small system window in front of him. The man in the black t-shirt told the guy that he should stop talking and should take the blindfold off the defeated man, because they only had 15 minutes left to complete the mission. The guy in the white t-shirt told him to calm down and added that he was too serious. He suggested they savor the moment a little. At their feet lay a victim with charred and blackened skin. A shocked Seon and a calm girl watched them. She said that they were green team guys and they annoyed her. At this time, a guy in a jersey was pulling his blue armband off the poor guy's arm. He, twirling the bandage around on his finger, informed his partner that he had gotten it. He stuck out his blue tongue with a mad expression on his face and told his partner that there was nothing left for them to catch and suggested that they go to the other side. The man in the black t-shirt agreed with him and added that they should hurry before they met up with the yellow team. Suddenly he noticed something, shifting his gaze to the other side. He saw Seon and a girl standing off to the side, then called out to his partner, calling his name Danny. He noticed the blue bandage on the girl's shoulder and said that they had a new prey. The girl abruptly grabbed Seon by the tie, after which she pulled him after her. She said that if the guy didn't want to die here, he should run. Seon replied to her that she was pulling the tie too hard and might strangle him. At this time, Danny reloaded his weapon, replacing his left arm, then released a green beam towards Seon and the girl. It almost reached them while being a meter away from them. Seon cried out fearfully, expecting imminent death, but suddenly the girl ran and pulled him behind her. They were able to avoid the attack. The girl rounded the corner and started running away as fast as possible, pulling Seon's tie. The tie was squeezing his neck hard, so his whole face turned red and he started panting. Danny laughed caustically as he glared at them and said that they were dodging pretty well. His partner rudely ordered them to catch them, to which Danny grudgingly clucked and agreed with him. A mechanism that looked like a blue light vortex activated on their boots. It allowed them to instantly lift off the ground and bounce high above the arena. Seon, who was running as fast as he could, turned around and anxiously asked with panic in his voice who they were and why they were shooting at them. The girl at this time was also running without slowing down her pace. Their opponents at this time soared into the air and were approaching them from above with their jet boots. Seon looked up hopelessly, panic and fear read in his face. Danny readied his gun again, preparing to fire, and with a mad grin he laughed. He told them to try and humor him some more. A green beam from his weapon headed towards the pair. It flew past, hitting a nearby wall, but it startled Seon a great deal, causing him to shriek and panic-stricken as he glanced at where the projectile had hit. Sweat dripped down his terrified face. He realized that it was too dangerous here, and in his dreams, the pain was quite tangible. He couldn't afford to die so foolishly. The mere thought of it made him run faster and faster, even overtaking the girl who was silently watching him. At that time the opponents were already approaching them, and Danny was preparing to take a shot again. The girl clucked unhappily. She pulled her katana out of its sheath and, after overtaking Seon, she rounded the corner. At that time Danny had already fired again, but this time the pair was lucky, and they were not hit by the projectile, which was literally a few meters short of hitting the target. They had already disappeared from the enemy's sight as they continued to run as fast as they could. Seon shouted anxiously, not realizing what awaited them next. The girl swung her katana and pierced one of the blocks with it. She began to swipe along it, leaving an oblong cut on it. Seon was watching her from behind at this time, trying to catch his breath and recover from the chase. The girl finished making the cut and pulled out her katana. Seon, breathing heavily, wondered how she had just cut through that wall. Suddenly, the cut on the blue wall took the shape of a mouth and began to gradually expand. The mouth opened completely, and inside it was emptiness and all-consuming darkness at first glance. The girl took Seon by the scruff of his neck and began to pull him into this passage. The guy tried to resist, asking her what she was doing. He yelled at her that she was crazy and sick in the head, but she still managed to push him into the passage and escape with him. The mouth on the wall closed, and then it began to fade away, becoming invisible as if nothing had happened. At this time, their opponents landed against the wall through which the pair had hidden. They looked at the empty passage with no one in it, and then the man in the black t-shirt said that he was sure they had turned this way. His partner answered him nothing, not realizing where they could have gone. Seon and the girl found themselves in some kind of room with black and white cages that were on the ceiling, walls, and floor. Seon asked what it was and said that he didn't remember him creating a flying man that also shoots lasers. He grudgingly asked where they were now. The girl looked at Seon, who was sitting on the floor and breathing heavily, wiping sweat from his face. She said that he needed to keep the fact that he was no longer in his dream in his mind. Seon looked at her incomprehensibly and apprehensively and asked what she was talking about, since it was obvious that he had been in a dream the whole time. She turned away from him and said that it was still a dream, but she meant that it was no longer his dream. Seon got up from the floor and interjected her about it not being his dream. He looked at her worriedly with his big red eyes and asked how that was possible. The girl turned her head in his direction and said that they were in an intertwined dream. She looked at him and said that it was the place where all those whose dreams had been stolen gathered, and also the place where he had to fight to get out alive. Seon, as if he didn't believe what she was talking about, and with a frightened face he asked her again if he had understood everything correctly. She looked at him with a nonchalant face and calmly replied that it was just as she said. She added that his dream had been stolen by someone and now he could no longer go back there. Sweat was running down Seon's face. He was very tense and swallowed anxiously. The girl said that black flying ball that the guy told her about was the proof of her words. Seon tried to calm himself down and brushed the girl off with the words that such a thing was simply impossible. She only gave him a slightly incomprehensible look and said that she wasn't lying and it was just the way it was. The girl explained that the thing that suddenly appeared above Seon in his dream was a black hole. It's a tool that appears in every conscious dream and its sole purpose is to steal other people's dreams just the way it happened to Seon. He stopped waving her away and looked at her with a look full of horror and despair. He put his head down and said that this couldn't be happening. He began to shake and with a shiver in his body he asked how could something like this instrument steal other people's dreams. Seon clenched his palms into fists and continued to look down. Suddenly, anger began to appear in him. He looked at the girl angrily and frowned his eyebrows and shouted at her that he was still in a dream and it was his and only his dream. After he finished swearing, he started breathing heavily, trying to regain his breath. The girl didn't react to his rage in any way and just looked at him. She covered her eyes tiredly and said that no matter whose dream it was, he could keep convincing himself and at one point he would just start to fear it. She added that if he didn't believe her, he could try to go back to where he would like to be now. Sion grudgingly put his hands on his hips and with an annoyed, angry face told her that was exactly what he was going to do. Even though he had no idea what had happened to him, he was going to put a stop to it. Sion brought a fist to his mouth and cleared his throat. Closing his eyes, he exhaled and began to inwardly concentrate. He told himself that he was returning to a peaceful, beautiful island that was surrounded by crystal clear ocean, to a splendor he had created called Mystic Island. An image of a small island appeared in his mind, which was in the middle of a blue, bright ocean, and above the city itself was an azure sky with clouds floating carefree. Sion imagined that he was hovering in the air with a relaxed face, not far from the tower erected in his honor. Sion visualized this place with clean air that was different from the air of the ordinary world, with a cool sea breeze. He convinced himself that he was about to return to his own world. The girl told him with a mocking tone that it was still taking a long time for all the information to reach him, thus breaking him away from his fantasies. Sion angrily asked her with a shout why she was still here, contorting his face in a grimace of rage. He calmed down and looked away, saying it didn't make any sense and didn't understand why he wasn't transported to his dream. The guy remembered the girl's words about the intertwined dream and that it was a place where those people who had had their dreams stolen from them gathered, and survival required fighting each other. The realization made the boy's eyebrows rise and he raised his head anxiously, thinking about the intertwined dream and the fact that his world was really out of his reach right now. The girl, without showing any emotion on her face, started to say that now that he realized the nature of the situation, he should start with something, but she didn't have a chance to finish due to Sion ordering her to stop messing with him, lowering her head and clenching her fists. He gritted his teeth and frowned. He couldn't believe what had happened to them and what she was saying. The girl suddenly changed her tone slightly to a more relaxed one and said that although it wasn't a joke, she apologized if it sounded that scary. She showed him the inside of her palm in apology. Sion was slightly taken aback and asked her to slow things down a bit. The girl turned away from him and looked down. She said that regarding this, she should give Sion a little hope. He didn't understand what she was talking about, so he asked what kind of hope. The girl turned her head in his direction, smiling faintly, and as she put her katana away in its scabbard, she said that his dream that was recently stolen could be recreated. Outside, Danny and his partner were looking for them, flying their jet boots over the arena. Danny tried to make out anything among the many identical blocks, but he found nothing, wondering where they could have gone. He shouted that he would get to them sooner or later. His comrade was looking at the system window in front of him, arms crossed over his chest, summoning with the blank command. There was a timer on the system window showing that they had 9 minutes and 32 seconds left. The man notified Danny that they had less than 10 minutes. He replayed the images of the girl and Sion in his head and thought about the fact that the girl definitely had a blue armband on her shoulder, and now the question was what color was that guy? At this time Sion and his new acquaintance were in a black and white room. Sion leaned his palm against the wall. He stood beside it leaning on it and asked if he had done everything correctly. He then asked if he could get his sleep back as long as he followed her instructions, chuckling nervously at the end. He looked at her slightly suspiciously and asked himself exactly if he could trust her, but then realized that he apparently had no other choice, while concurrently thinking about why the girl had told him to put his hand on the wall. She started to walk towards him, which made Sion tense up. He wanted to tell her that he would feel better if she explained everything to him, but the girl interrupted him, telling him firmly that she hadn't lied to him. She walked almost right up to the guy before looking him in the face and telling him that he didn't have to worry about it. Sion was a little embarrassed about her getting so close to him. The girl moved even closer to him. She took out her katana again and stabbed the wall with it, forming a passage again. Sion, who had his hand on the wall, yelped and instantly began to fall through the formed exit. The girl took one last look at him and said that all he had to do was not to die. Sion tried to object something to her, however by this time the girl had already removed her katana from the cut and the mouth on the wall closed, engulfing Sion into itself. The girl silently looked at the wall, holding her blade in her hand. The passage on the other side seemed to spit Sion out and he instantly ran forward, relieved for a second. He looked around with a confused look and realized that he was back where it had started. There were blue blocks around him again, surrounding him everywhere. At this time Danny noticed him with his cybernetic red eye and made a mad look on his face and said, "Here's the guy," and got him. His partner, standing on the edge of one of the blocks, asked Sion how he got there. At this time, Danny had already jumped down and was flying towards Sion. The guy made a disappointed look on his face and thought that the girl had ended up fooling him. The man in the black t-shirt ordered Danny to catch him, to which he agreed with him. At this time, the two of them were already hovering over the arena. While Danny aimed his weapon at the poor man, he ran away as fast as he could and yelled that he was, then, just bait. Danny readied his weapon and yelled that he was about to fire a beam 4 at the Lego, then shot his green projectile at the guy. Seon managed to jump forward, avoiding the attack. He was very scared. As the green light from the beam shone behind him, he tearfully thought about how he should get his sleep back, and the girl turned out to be a cheat. Danny and his partner continued to hover in the sky, chasing their victim. He fired several beams at him, each time calling them by type beam 5 and beam 6. Seon noticed this and in a panic yelled out why the beam digit was growing. Danny kept firing and the number in the name kept increasing. The man in the black t-shirt slightly tensed up and looked at the fleeing Seon and said that although he was only running away, but he has tremendous speed and would be hard to catch even with Danny. Seon continued to run away among the blue-colored blocks that were rising nearby, which seemed to form a maze that could easily get confused. He turned back and with a slightly smug face said that the attack seemed to have stopped and asked himself if he had gotten away from them. He looked at his opponent who continued to fly towards him without slowing down. Seon smiled and thought that even though they could fly, they were no match for him in terms of speed and he would be able to escape if he kept going. But something told him that this face was not just that of a stalker, but of someone who had already managed to catch his victim. He thought of that as he looked at the utterly crazed face of Danny, who narrowed his eyes, raised his eyebrows, and smiled, sticking out his bright blue tongue. Seon looked straight ahead again, in panic and despair. He saw a high wall in front of him, and there was nowhere to run. He had driven himself into a dead end. The boy gritted his teeth and didn't know what to do now. He heard Danny and his partner already landed behind him and realized there was no escape route. Danny was beyond furious, his face red with anger. He yelled at Seon that all he could do was run away, but he was very good at it, then called him a rat. His partner said in a calm tone that they shouldn't kill Seon yet, because the girl had a blue patch. Seon stood with his back to them, head down and eyes closed. He thought about the laser and realized that Danny had stopped at beam 16, and he certainly wouldn't survive being shot at from that distance. He remembered that girl and told himself that he shouldn't have trusted her. Suddenly Seon was visited by an epiphany. He thought about death and realized that after death people are usually transported to another dream or wake up. The guys behind him were mocking him. Danny said they would get to the point now and ordered Seon to turn towards them and start jumping like a frog. Seon tensed up. He wasn't too sure about his inference of dying in his sleep, but he suddenly had a change in his face and smiled slyly at the thought of at least trying it. Danny exhaled irritably and said that he was bored with the whole thing. He gave Seon 10 seconds to tell him where that girl was hiding and warned him that he hated waiting. He pointed his gun at him and started counting down from 10. Danny counted down to 7 as suddenly Seon, standing with his back to them, started talking about where the girl was now. Danny started smiling madly again, encouraging Seon to tell them everything as soon as possible, and his friend looked at the timer and said they only had 3 minutes left. Seon abruptly turned to them and pointed at them with his index finger. He said with an angry face that the girl was in a place he would never tell them about. He shouted at Danny to stop talking and finish him off already. Seon smiled naively, trying to portray confidence, but himself inwardly thinking about what he had heard, that the pain in dreams was quite palpable and it would be great if they got it done quickly and cleanly. He felt he could have been done with this a long time ago, if only it wasn't for that sneaky reference to the girl. Danny laughed and pointed a finger at Seon, asking his comrade if he had heard what the guy had just said. His partner sullenly answered him that the whole thing was really boring him. He told Danny that he didn't care anymore and let him do what he wanted, because they had already failed this mission anyway. They had no time left. Danny stuck out his tongue and said he understood him, then turned to Seon, calling him a noble frog, and asked if he was going to sacrifice himself for his lady. Seon was confused and taken aback for a second because he thought he and that girl were a couple. He angrily thought that this was the first time he had been mentioned in such a manner, and it was happening in the cube. Danny in the meantime took the top off his weapon, modifying it and putting a different muzzle on it. He slowly began to load his weapon, preparing to straighten out Seon. With a cocky expression on his face, he called Seon a hero lover and ordered him to die. Seon at the same second started to backpedal and try to tell Danny that he had it all wrong, while noticing that he had changed his weapon. Danny started running towards Seon and his weapon changed from a firearm to a laser blade. He asked Seon with a gambling face if he seriously thought he would give him an easy death. Seon shouted to him that he would savor every moment they had left. While his partner stood behind him, he was rapidly approaching the unarmed Seon who had nowhere to run. Seon tried to assume a defensive posture, but his face betrayed all the fear and terror he was feeling. He realized that Danny was aware of the fact the pain in the dream was palpable, just like in reality. Danny was already close enough to Seon to attack him, so shouted to him that he would start with his right arm, swinging his laser. Seon only had to watch as the deadly weapon flew at him. He realized that if things continued like this, he risked excruciating pain and a merciless, long death. Suddenly, a mouth appeared from the cube above, and it was wide open. A blade stuck out of it, pointing downwards. The mouth spat out the man who emerged from there, who then rushed straight at Seon's opponents. The flow of wind caused the man in the black t-shirt to be thrown back slightly as he struggled to stay in place. The person who fell out of the cube turned out to be the girl who was with Seon before. She was holding her katana with both hands, which was stuck somewhere. The girl exhaled heavily and tiredly. She pulled the tip of her blade out of Danny's back, which had various mechanisms, wires and metal inside instead of bones and organs. Seon looked at her with surprise and somewhat relief as he regained his breath. The girl said she hadn't lied to him. She stood sideways to him, locks of her hair covering her face. The girl said that if he really wanted to get back what he had lost, he shouldn't die. She stood with her back to him, turning her head in his direction and holstering her katana. At her feet lay the breathless body of Danny. The air above them left a trail of smoke in the air where the girl had come from. There was silence all around. Danny's body began to vaporize, and this process was accompanied by green smoke emanating from his body. Seon, who noticed this, was very surprised. The madman's body was slowly disappearing, but only his green armband and the blue armband of the man he and his partner had killed before were left on the ground. When Danny's corpse was almost gone, the girl began to reach down for the bandages. She took them for herself. The man in the black t-shirt took off his red glasses and looked up. He looked at the lips that were still on the cube above. He asked the girl if she had an item that allowed her to distort space through special markings, and even if so, how she managed to be on top. The girl clutched a blue armband in her hand and asked the man if it would be useful where he was going. She put the green armband on her shoulder and looked at the man emotionlessly. At this time, Seon behind her back was still trying to realize what had just happened while in the puffs of smoke and dust. The man put his glasses back on and realized that Danny had put him in a rather problematic situation. He said that didn't change the point and reached for the sword at his back. He grabbed it by the hilt and pointed it towards the girl and yelled that to get the blindfold he would just kill them. Not a single muscle trembled on the face of the girl who was looking at him. The man pointed his fist, which had something resembling knuckles in the shape of a signet, in her direction and launched an attack called phalanx. A projectile resembling a metal spike flew out of his knuckles. The girl gave him a serious look and said that he was wasting his hopes on ranged attacks just because she was carrying a sword. She reflected the projectile with her katana and said mockingly, "What a pity." The man grabbed his massive sword with both hands and said he would give her a clue. This projectile was a deceptive maneuver. At this time, the projectile that bounced off the sword spun in the air and flew upwards. He looked at her and used a technique called exchange, after which he disappeared. He was behind the girl's back, where the bounced projectile had originally flown, and was preparing to attack her with his cold weapon. The girl turned on him and was already holding her katana at the ready. The two had a collision, hidden behind a veil of smoke, and in the meantime the projectile was in the same place where the man had been standing. Seon covered his face from the gusts of wind and marveled at the incredible power of the attack and thought that no one would have survived something like that. He looked at the battlefield, which was finally starting to clear of smoke, and only noticed the silhouette of a man with a ringing sound coming from his sword. He didn't realize where the girl had gone like that. There was a dent left where the man had struck, a small crater in the ground. At this time, the girl was standing to his right a few meters away. The man looked at the timer again and stated the fact that he only had a minute left and told the girl that she had managed to dodge at that distance. He added that it would probably take some time. The girl looked at him with a blank, cold stare, and a cut on her cheek showed, from which blood flowed. The man shifted his gaze to Seon, who still looked terribly scared and confused. He thought of something and slightly raised his eyebrows. Seon exhaled tensely as he looked at the girl and said that at least she had managed to avoid the attack. He scratched his temple with his finger and asked himself why he even cared about this, in his opinion, deceitful girl. At this time, there was already a man standing behind him, who displayed his giant sword in front of Seon. The man, threatening the guy with death, shouted to the girl and offered her a deal. Seon trembled in panic, and his face seemed to turn blue with fear. The girl remained silent for the time being and decided to listen to him. He looked at her sullenly and said that she had already figured out that among all the colors, he needed blue and green armbands. There were a total of 7 colors of armbands: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, blue, and purple. The man said that the girl just had an extra color armband, blue. She was just clenching it in her fist at the time. The man brought his blade closer to the neck of Seon, who was trying to get as far away from him as possible, and said that it was strange that the boy didn't have any armbands and then what team he was on. Seon, feeling panic and misunderstanding, turned around and looked at the man. He reflected that he had been asked the exact same question by a girl when they first met. She had threatened him with her blade then too. The man continued to hold Seon hostage. The boy squealed softly in fear. Their enemy said that at first he assumed the kid had just taken off his blindfold, but for some reason he wasn't destroyed within 5 minutes after that. The girl continued to stare at them in silence. Suddenly, the man shouted sharply that he was now definitively convinced that he was not a cuber like he and the girl. The man's tone made Seon tense up even more and cocked his head higher to keep the blade from digging into his neck. The man furrowed his eyebrows and said that he had no idea how Seon managed to get here without being a cuber. He shifted his gaze to the cuber world, looking at the multicolored blocks that hovered in the air. He continued speaking and said that if for some reason the kid died while in the cube, he would never be able to get his dream back. There was a sepulchral silence in the arena. No one was in a hurry to start dialogue again. They all looked at each other in silence. Seon sank into despair, pondering the words that he would never be able to get his dream back. It was as if everything had fallen into darkness for him. He lowered his head, tensed up, and thought that this could not be happening. Suddenly, someone spoke. It was a girl. She said that everything was right, and as the man said, Seon was not a cuber, and if he died here, he could never get his dream back. The girl continued to speak in a cold tone, showing no emotion. The man faintly smiled and said that she had finally spoken since they only had 20 seconds to finish the mission. He continued to hold his sword around Seon's neck. One could see how weak and small Seon was compared to the man who was taller than him by a head and twice as wide. The man offered a deal again, a blue armband in exchange for the boy's dreams. He added that it was a fair deal in which neither party would be shortchanged. The girl clutched the blue armband tighter in her right hand. The man said that the girl couldn't refuse it. At this time, Seon was in complete confusion and bewilderment. He pressed his lips together, his pupils narrowed, and he didn't understand what kind of nonsense about the deal they were talking about. The man shifted his gaze to the timer with only 13 seconds left on the mission. He ordered her to hurry up with her decision, for they were running out of time. He yelled in an ordered and aggressive tone for her to throw him the blue armband. He looked truly threatening when he said that. Seon's nerves were also on edge. He clenched his teeth tightly and frowned. He internally told her that she had an extra one and just let her give it to him already. The girl silently wiped the blue bandage with the blood that flowed from a small cut on her cheek. The timer showed that there were only 10 seconds left. The girl stained the bandage with her blood, smearing the blood on her cheek. She asked why on earth she would give it to her. The man looked at her with a nonchalant expression while Seon almost turned blue with fear and horror. The man took his sword away from the guy's neck. He lowered his gaze slightly so that his green eyes could be seen behind his glasses. He asked the girl, saying that she wasn't originally going to give it back, and asked if that was the case. He shifted his gaze to the timer with 7 seconds left on it and said that he had only wasted his time. Seon became horrified, realizing that it was just a hopeless situation right now. He opened his mouth in shock and couldn't believe that he was about to lose all his dreams. The only question in his mind was why. The girl pulled out her black blade once again. The man behind him grabbed his sword tighter and started swinging it with shouts that if he did so, he would just destroy all of this kid's dreams. The timer kept running out on all of this. The girl made a hole in the wall with her katana. At this time, the man had already started to swing his sword. Seon at this time closed his eyes and clenched his teeth, waiting for the inevitable. He thought about why the fate of his creation was determined by someone like them. At the last moment, when the sword was about to pierce him in the next instant, he shouted his thought aloud, clenching his fists and raising his head aloft. In exactly 1 second, something strange happened. The girl was lightning fast to the other side, holding her katana with her left hand, and the sword in the man's hands was in the sky along with his severed palms. The man's arms were missing below his hands, his glasses flew off of him, and he stared at them in silent shock before shifting his gaze to the other side. He saw that another mouth-shaped passage had opened up in the ground, and he didn't realize when she had managed to place the mark there. He figured she had managed to do it the time she had impaled his partner with her sword, falling on top of them. He told himself he had been too stupid. The bandage from his wrist began to fall down, before he himself was knocked off his feet and fell on his back. The green armband fell right onto the left shoulder of Seon, who was in a stupor. The timer went to 0, as evidenced by a chicken appearing in the sky and a gilded egg holder that had a time counter on it. The chicken shouted the number of the cubic mission 8i8 and announced that it was complete. Seon turned around and saw the girl tucking her katana back into the scabbard behind her back. Chicken announced that they were moving on to the evaluation stage. The girl turned towards Seon and looked at him sullenly. The chickens making the announcements were several in the arena. They hovered overhead, controlling the entire process. Instead of a timer, an inscription appeared on them, signaling the end of the mission. They said that before the evaluation stage, it was worth considering the fact that all battles still ongoing would be considered a gross violation of the rules. They asked everyone to raise the armbands they had obtained above their heads. The multitude of people in the cube raised their armbands of different colors. One of them had a sword whose blade was in the shape of piano keys. On the battlefield, the bodies of the people who couldn't survive the ordeal were vaporized. Someone who had passed the test shouted that this mission was very boring. Some person sat down on one knee and started complaining about the arrogant newcomers taking away bandages they didn't even need. The chickens announced that the 36 had successfully completed the mission, and they were continuing the inspection. Seon lifted his head up, removing the green armband from his shoulder, and asked incomprehensibly if this was really all a mission. The girl, who had already lifted her blindfolds up, handed Seon one extra blue blindfold, saying that he should hurry up if he didn't want to remain dreamless forever. He was slightly taken aback and looked at her questioningly. Seon pointed her index finger at herself and asked if she would really just give it to him like that. She calmly said that she wasn't forcing him, but suddenly they announced that the mission was about to end, causing Seon to raise his head up. He embarrassedly lifted both bandages into the air, his face blushing heavily. He asked if he could now get his sleep back. The girl remained silent, quietly exhaling. At this time, the announcement that 37 had completed the mission was heard. The chicken hovering above him said that 260 dream points would be distributed to the 37 players that had successfully completed the mission, and they would now be transferred to cube number 1i1. Seon asked what the dream points were but never got an answer. Suddenly, steam began to emanate from his body, and then Seon disappeared, leaving only small puffs of steam on the ground. Seon found himself in a room where there was a large gray floor clock, behind which could be seen a huge mechanism with many gears of different sizes. The minute hand moved with a loud tick. Seon opened his eyes wide, looking around. All the walls, floors, and other things were the same gray color as the clock. He looked at the people in the room, whose costumes looked more like those of characters from a video game. They were talking to each other about something, and Seon didn't realize where he had been thrown again. In fact, they were in the cube number 1i1. Next to Seon stood the girl who had accompanied him during the previous mission. She turned to the guy and said that they were in location 1i1. It is located on the first floor and serves as a starting point. It is called the gray area. He was a bit startled due to the fact that she rather abruptly appeared next to him and spoke. Seon asked with a concerned look if everything here was really gray. The girl turned her head in his direction and said that there were many dreams intertwined here, inside the cube itself. Seon continued to look around with a very confused look. He looked around at the players, who looked like they were gathered from different genres of video games, because some of them looked like medieval knights, some of them looked like astronauts and were surrounded by planets, some of them were dressed in traditional Korean costumes, and some of them were holding a lion next to them. Seon said that in the cube all these people shared the same dream, but he couldn't believe it until the end. The girl shifted her gaze towards the guy and asked if it was hard for him to believe it all. Seon awkwardly scratched his chin and replied that it was actually really not that easy for him to accept it all. The girl told him that, as he had heard earlier, the people that try to break through to the very depths of the cube are called cubers. She visualized it in her head as if a great many people were on different levels of the cube, some higher and some lower. The cube was a multitude of floors, which in turn were divided roughly like a chessboard. Before they were in cube number 8i8, where I was the floor designation and the numbers 8 denoted the position of the cells. The girl continued her speech by saying that somehow, even without being a cuber, the guy had managed to break through to the first floor. Suddenly, she abruptly placed her right hand on the wall near the guy's head, thus nailing him to the wall. Seon didn't expect this and panicked badly. She leaned against him and told him to listen to him carefully. Out of fear, he nodded his head to her, being ready for anything. She said that before he tried to get his dream back, he should remember that once he died here, he would never get his dreams back. The girl turned around, after which she glanced at her watch. She said that they should be moving out by now. She stepped away from him, after which Seon asked what he needed to do to get back to his dream. She answered nothing to that, looking at something on the system window near her wrist, but said that they needed to meet that night at 10 o'clock. Seon asked her again what she meant by that. She turned in his direction and said to come to cube number 2i1. She clicked on something on the system window and then started to vaporize, calling the guy by his first and last name last. Seon tried to stop her to get some clarification from her, but as soon as he turned to her, the girl had already vaporized and disappeared from the lobby. He, still standing in a stupor, thought for a moment. He wondered if he had heard her actually say his name, even though he had never introduced himself to her. But it was much more important to him that because she had vanished too quickly, he wouldn't know how to wake up. He looked around the hall, determined to find players he could ask about it. But one by one they started to vaporize too, saying goodbye to each other. There was a window on the wall through which a few blurry silhouettes could be seen. As Seon ran from one disappearing player to another, someone was watching him from that window, standing with a smoking pipe. This person was exhaling tobacco smoke while standing right in front of the large panoramic window. He was dressed in a jacket and pants, had fairly long hair, and his assistant or colleague was standing next to him behind him. He said that it had been quite a while and something fun seemed to be coming up. Seon at this time was trying to activate the same system window on his wrist as the girls, but he was having no luck. The bulky clock in the room kept going. Suddenly the minute hand moved and it was exactly 7 on the clock. They began to make a loud noise while Seon spent all this time trying to figure out where his system window was. The guy turned his attention to the clock, turning around. The clock continued to make a sound until Seon started to vaporize like all the other players in the hall. He didn't realize anything at first and shouted softly in panic. But in the next instant, he found himself in his room, in the real world. He opened his eyes wide, sweat dripping down his face. Unlike in the dream, in real life his eyes were dark gray, not red. He was lying in his bed, dressed in green pajamas. He tried to catch his breath by grabbing the bedclothes. Seon shouted that he was back. He started to get up, sitting down on the bed. His face was puzzled and worried. He kept thinking about the intertwined dream. The clock in his room on the shelf showed 7:02. Two teams were playing on the basketball court on the school grounds. The referee yelled out that the blue team was winning with a score of 89 and the red team was losing with a score of 67. The blue team immediately started cheering. A guy from the red team named Gi-won grabbed his jersey and started pulling on it to get a stream of fresh air under his clothes. At the same time, he drank water and started complaining. He said that if that ratty kid had shown up today, they could have won, referring to Seon, and asked why he wasn't going to school at all. His friend, Lee Hyuk, was standing nearby wiping himself with a towel from sweat, being exhausted, and didn't answer him anything. Apparently, these two were Seon's classmates. Suddenly, Lee Hyuk, while still wiping himself from sweat, shifted his gaze to someone who was walking nearby. It was Seon, who was walking hunched over with his backpack on the wall with his head down. Lee Hyuk started to remember how he used to walk past them in the hallway while Gi-won was eating pizza and praising it, how he always stayed away from everyone, not talking to anyone. Gi-won asked him where he was looking, which interrupted Lee Hyuk's musings, and then he saw that it was Seon and called him ratty again. Gi-won said that if he's not mistaken, Seon left pretty early yesterday too. Gi-won asked if Seon was leaving already, then remembered that the architecture class would be in the evening, which he told his friend. Lee Hyuk was confused and asked him again, to which Gi-won said he didn't know about it because he had recently transferred. He told him that at the very beginning of the semester, Seon told everyone that all these classes were useless except for architecture, and just walked out. He then walked out of the class, leaving all of his classmates puzzled. Gi-won also shared that he always leaves after this class, and in the past few days, they didn't have an architecture class, so he didn't come to school. He shared that he thought he was pretty weird since middle school, after which he wanted to add something but changed his mind and asked Lee Hyuk to forget about it. Lee Hyuk himself looked at his friend in surprise without saying a word. Gi-won crumpled the drink bottle and said that he needed to cheer himself up. He called Lee Hyuk to go to the game room with him and have fun there. Lee Hyuk, who took off his red t-shirt, smiled awkwardly, not knowing what to say to him. He scratched the back of his head and looked away, saying that he actually had some things to do and had to go. A surprised Gi-won tried to ask what the business was, but Lee Hyuk had already managed to run away from the basketball court, leaving Gi-won at a loss all by himself. The red mailbox outside Seon's house was filled to the top with letters. The mailman delivering a new letter looked at the box and asked himself what he should do with it. A girl was passing by, about to throw out the garbage. The letter carrier continued to be indignant and thought that no one lived in this house, and there was no room for new letters. At this time Seon was already walking home, who had his head down and was holding on to the straps of his backpack. He abruptly snatched the letter right out of the mailman's hands without saying anything to him. The letter carrier was surprised at his insolence and said what a cheeky behavior he had. Seon at the same time had already opened the gate of his house and was on his way in. He threw the letter in the trash with the rest of the crumpled papers without even opening or reading it. The guy pulled out his smartphone and started looking at something on it. He remembered those words from the Cube girl about them meeting this night at 10 o'clock. The smartphone was showing 7:23 p.m. She then also added that they would meet in cube number 2I1. Seon continued to stare sullenly at his smartphone. He went to the window in his room and grabbed the curtains. He said that someone had stolen his dream and he wouldn't rest until he got it back. He needed to find him. He pulled up his black curtains completely and then went to sleep. At first he found himself in a dark void, saying it was dark and asking where he was. Suddenly someone behind his back told him that he had come rather late. Seon turned around in surprise and looked at the speaker. It turned out to be a girl with a glass in her hand and turquoise hair. She introduced herself by the name Ririn. She had large amber eyes and in her ears she had orange star earrings to match her eye color. She was dressed in a bartender's uniform, and she had a glass of red wine in her hand. Ririn stood behind the bar, which had a countersign hanging on it and had a lot of different alcohol on the shelves. She greeted Seon and said that this establishment was exclusively for him and invited him to check it out as well. There was a single stool at the bar counter. Seon averted his gaze, remembering where else he had heard about the inspection. He had been told about it by a girl he had met in the cube. That time she had said he had failed the test. Ririn turned her attention to him, asking if he would continue to stand there. Seon broke away from his thoughts and walked over to the bar. The girl began pouring white wine into his glass. Seon, sitting on a bar stool, began to look around and apologized to Ririn for his behavior. She asked what it was about and said that judging from his behavior, all she could say was that he had a few questions. He rubbed the back of his head awkwardly and asked if he could ask them. Ririn, who had finished pouring the wine, garnished her glass with a lemon slice and said he could ask his question. He wanted to ask her about the cube and the test, but Ririn interrupted him and offered him a glass of wine, smiling kindly and friendly. He shook his head from side to side and declined, as he didn't drink alcohol. She smiled slyly and said in a quiet voice, covering her mouth with the palm of her hand, that he shouldn't refuse, because it was his own world, so he could have a drink. Seon started to awkwardly wave it away, feeling embarrassed. He said that he was still a schoolboy and he wasn't allowed to drink. The barmaid continued to hold out his glass. She said that if he said so, she had no choice. Ririn drank the entire contents of the glass at once, getting tipsy at the same second and saying that since she didn't want to drink, she would drink it all herself. Seon looked at her confusedly at this time. He smiled awkwardly and asked if he could enter the cube if he passed the test. Ririn's face was heavily flushed from the alcohol and she smiled widely but did not answer the question. Seon asked if she was listening to him, but the next moment she collapsed on the bar, causing Seon to be confused and unsure of what to do. He realized that she had passed out, for Ririn began to sniffle. Apparently, when she fell on the bar, she accidentally pressed the remote and it vibrated. After that, something strange caught Seon's attention. A board with a list of items appeared behind the bar. He gradually read through it until something made him tense up. On the list of items was a dream Seon had called Mystic Island. The guy realized that his dream was for sale. He looked at his dream on the item list again. Seon's face contorted in a grimace of horror and hopelessness. He didn't understand why his dream was for sale. At this time, Ririn woke up, opening her eyes. She stood up abruptly from the bar stool, then startled the expecting nothing Seon. Her face had traces of the saliva she had drooled in her sleep, and her star earring stuck to her cheek. There was still a blush on her face. She asked how long she had slept. The earring peeled off her cheek, leaving a distinctive mark on it. Ririn ordered Seon to explain herself. They looked at each other perplexedly for a while. Ririn turned around and saw a list of items on the screen. She clapped her hands together and decided that she had stopped there, which meant she was almost done, in her opinion. Seon tried to explain to her what had happened, but she wasn't listening. He noticed that the atmosphere had suddenly changed. The girl rubbed her eyes, squeezing her eyes shut. Her eyelids felt so heavy she wanted to sleep. She picked up the remote and said that in that case she would continue her explanation. Seon stopped her and stood up from the bar stool and said he had more questions. Still slightly drunk, Ririn said he could ask them. He worriedly asked why this cube was selling his dream and wasn't it stolen from him. He said he had the right to take it back. Ririn looked at him irritably and furrowed her eyebrows, then asked him to be quiet, for the guy was making too much noise. She shifted her gaze to the empty glass and said that as the manager of the cube, she could only say one thing to him. Her face looked calm, but at the same time a little tense. She said that the only way out was to purchase the dream, for dreams could not be recovered. Seon was obligated to buy it back. The cost of his dream was 1,000 dream points. Ririn explained to him that intertwined dreams were solid cubes and verification zones. The dimensions of the cube were 9 in length, 9 in width, and 9 in height. In addition to the main cube, there were check zones. Unlike the check zones, the cells of the cube are public zones. In order to get any dreams, he needed to collect dream points in missions conducted by the cube itself. They looked like round, gold-plated coins. Ririn asked Sion if he had any idea how hard it was to collect 1,000 of these points. She said it could take months or even years. He could even permanently lose all his dreams in an attempt to get them back. Sion listened to this information worriedly at first, then said with a confident look that it didn't matter to him how long it took, even if it was years, but he was obligated to get his dreams back. Ririn smiled and whistled. She asked if he wanted to test himself. The girl pressed the big red button on her side of the bar and said that for the cube he should have an item to mop up missions, some sort of weapon. A small screen appeared on Sion's side of the bar, which surprised him a bit. Sion asked what the items were, to which Ririn clapped her hands and said that the screen in front of him showed 5 options and he had to choose 2 of them. There were 5 categories on the screen: damage, defense, agility, detection, and recovery. Ririn said that the items change depending on which abilities he chooses. She yawned tiredly, covering her mouth with her palm, and advised him to choose wisely as it would be impossible to change his mind later. Sion looked at the screen and asked if she wanted him to choose 2 of them. Ririn laid back on the bar again, almost falling asleep, and said that he just needed to lightly click on his favorite choices and the item would be given to him automatically during the mission. He understood that the damage category gave him weapons, and defense gave him shields. He also roughly understood the recovery option. He pictured in his head schematic little men who held a sword and shield, and a third who could regenerate his own health. Sion didn't quite understand what dexterity and detection were, so he didn't think of schematic images for them. Ririn told him to pick 2 categories out of 5. He wondered if they should be combined with each other somehow. He imagined that damage plus defense equaled sword-type weapons and shield with armor, and damage plus recovery gave the ability to attack opponents and heal yourself in parallel. Sion decided to ask Ririn about it and turned to her, but noticed that she was lying on the bar again and was silent. He realized that she had fallen asleep again. Sion looked at the screen again and started thinking about what item to take for the mission and figured he'd better try everything himself. Sitting on the bar stool, he remembered his first and so far last mission where he had been threatened with weapons by all 3 players he had met then. He decided that he definitely needed to get a weapon and then clicked on the appropriate icon on the screen. He began to think about which second category to choose. He looked at the dexterity and detection options. The time on Ririn's watch was showing 7:50 p.m. Sion selected something, after which a door appeared nearby. A light source illuminated it from above, making the door more visible. Sion turned his attention to the door and looked at it. He walked over to it and began to look at it, not understanding where it came from. Standing in front of it, he assumed that this mysterious door would lead him to the cube. Above the door hung the number 2I2. It was the zone number the girl had told him about back in the gray area. Sion turned around one last time and looked at the list of items, at the top of which was his dream worth 1,000 dream points. He looked around the bar, whereupon Ririn woke up and stretched. It was 7:59 p.m. on her watch. She rubbed her eyes with her palms and wondered when she had managed to fall asleep when suddenly the door to the area slammed shut. The already familiar Sion chickens were flying in the sky above the arena. They were wearing signs that mission preparations were underway. They announced that the mission was about to begin. The chickens said that anyone who didn't want to participate should leave the game area. Sion, who had just come out of the door, looked around with a surprised face and asked himself if he was in Cube 2I2. The chickens announced that the time would be in 5 seconds and started the countdown. In the arena were a ferocious werewolf, a blonde woman in a black hat, a knight in medieval armor, and someone in a rabbit costume. A huge iron leg appeared above Sion, startling him greatly. He saw that it was a giant whose height was taller than a skyscraper. It was completely made of metal, being clad in armor. The chickens ended the countdown and announced that the waiting time was over and they were welcoming all 328 participants. Sion, continuing to stare at the giant, was surprised at the number of participants, noting that it was indeed a lot. He couldn't believe that they were all cubers. A huge number of all sorts of players had gathered below, and at this time, the chickens hovering in the sky announced that the mission in Area 2I2 would soon be activated. Within the arena, tall stone walls began to appear out of the wasteland. Their appearance made the ground shudder, which made Sion dumbfounded and thought an earthquake had started. The chickens announced that the theme of today's mission was chaos. In the arena amidst the desert of sand, there were now tall towers connected by walls of stone blocks. The weather in the arena was nice, the sun was shining brightly and the sky was a bright blue. The chickens said that they called this game the Labyrinth of Chaos. The whole structure really resembled a maze with various buildings inside. It had 6 gates, respectively 5 entrances for the players. The rules of this game were quite simple. The goal of each player is to find the hidden sphere and leave the maze. From the bird's eye view, it was visible that the place where the players were in was also enclosed by high walls, and beyond it was just a desert with only huge boulders and rocks. Each participant in the mission must find one sphere, and if a player tried to pick up more than one sphere, they would not be able to leave the maze. There was no time limit. Once the first 16 people complete the task, the mission would end. The chickens were labeled 0 out of 16. They schematically visualized what the end of the match should look like: 16 winners, each with one sphere, and the rest flying by. The players were all ready to start. Among them were huge worms, green monsters resembling dinosaurs, and maniacs as if from nightmares. The chickens announced the start of the game and all the participants instantly ran towards the gate, including the iron giant that Sion had met earlier. The guy stood in a stupor with his eyes open, watching everyone run towards the gate. The running in the arena caused dust and sand to rise into the air, reducing visibility for a while. Sion looked to his left and saw a werewolf that had also sprinted towards the maze. He was surprised that it wasn't even human. Sion looked at the shapeshifter and said that he thought this area was meant for people who had lost their dreams. The mysterious stranger under the umbrella said that Sion had gotten it right. He was perched on one of the large boulders, of which there were many in the arena. He said that the cube was a place where people who had lost their dreams gathered. Sion turned his attention to it and turned his head toward the stranger. A giant in silver armor walked past them leisurely. He headed towards entrance number 6. The stranger gave him a glance and said that he was simply enormous. The guy turned to Sion and told him that Iron Giant and the werewolf nearby were people like him. Sion, who didn't understand anything, asked with a surprised face if the guy claimed that werewolves really existed. The stranger barely held back a chuckle and said that Sion was apparently one of those people. He said that he was at least making an interesting first impression of himself. The guy's face was hidden behind the shadow of an umbrella. Sion didn't understand what kind of first impression he was talking about, but the stranger meanwhile started to get up from the rock, shaking his pants off the dust, and said that he got it right and there were not only werewolves, but also iron giants. He elegantly jumped off the rock, landing close to Sion. He said that these magical creatures existed, of course, only on the condition that he was in a cube. The stranger asked Sion if this mission was his first. Sion was a little confused, but answered in the affirmative. He thought that he had been on the mission before, but this was the first time he was on it alone. The stranger put the umbrella aside and said that looking at Sion, he was reminded of his first arrival cube. Back then things were pretty rough. He said that in the cube they called him Jai-1. Jai-1 was very handsome. He had stylishly styled red hair, big light brown eyes, and neat eyebrows. His ears were pierced and he wore black-colored cross earrings, and he had a leather choker with a silver ring around his neck. He was dressed in a white fancy-cut shirt and wore black pants with suspenders. Jai-1's beauty seemed to dazzle Sion, who even narrowed his eyes slightly while looking at the guy. He noted his beauty, scratched the back of his head, and awkwardly introduced himself to Jai-1 in return. The guy replied to him that it was nice to meet him and he would call him Sion. Sion was a little confused. He was surprised that the guy had a separate name in a cube, like he was some kind of idol. Jai-1 looked around and said that there might be a place here where people share their dreams, but like Sion, they were all forcibly brought here from their own dreams. He shifted his gaze to the huge knight entering gate number 6, saying that in their dreams, these people could become iron giants or werewolves like the one that passed by them. Jai-1 closed his black umbrella and looked at the blonde woman wearing a black wide-brimmed hat and a chic black and white dress, who was holding an elegant red fan. He said that people could also become a beautiful lady. Sion also looked at the woman and marveled that people in their dreams could also become a woman. The woman smiled slightly, showing her scarlet lipstick in all its glory, and covered her face with the fan. Jai-1, smiling in a friendly manner, said that this place showed the form he was in the last time he was in his dream. Of course, his current appearance might be different from the real one. Sion relaxed a bit as he looked at the departing werewolf and the lady. He looked at his palms, after which he looked over his clothes. He said with a more understanding face that this was the reason why he still looked like a hero from a dream. Jai-1 incomprehensibly asked what kind of hero. At this time, behind a large boulder, someone was hiding in the shadows, smiling widely and baring his teeth. It was the silhouette of a guy with disheveled hair who wore goggles over a bandage on his forehead. He shifted his gaze towards Jae-won and Seon, chuckling softly and continuing to smile. Already, most of the players had gone to the maze and there weren't many people in the area that was in front of the entrance anymore. The mysterious watcher began to come out of his hiding place, revealing his blue sandals. Suddenly, a lock of hair on Jae-won's head started twitching as if to point at the guy coming out from behind a rock. Jae-won and Seon turned around, looking at the stranger. He held a pink swim lap in his hand and said that Jae-won described everything very well. He smiled slightly and said that somehow he had to remember that you usually took the shape you possessed in your dream. He pointed to his blue-colored goggles and the tank top with the clasp worn over his swimsuit. He said that in addition to taking the form, one could use the items to be stylish, stick to fashion, and even enhance oneself. He took a step forward, showing the boys his blue sandals. He appeared before them in his unique outfit, a black swimsuit and an orange zippered t-shirt and sand-colored shorts worn over it. A rope was tied to a blue circle. He stood in a strange pose, telling them to behold a true stylish cuber. Jae-won's face creased in disgust at the same second. He even twitched at such tastelessness. Seon, on the other hand, looked at him a bit judgmentally, saying that he looked disgusting. The narcissistic guy started to say something, adopting a proud pose, but he noticed that Seon and Jae-won weren't paying attention to him and were walking off in the other direction. Seon asked Jae-won if he knew the guy, to which he replied in the negative and said he didn't want to know him. The stranger, who saw this with a frustrated look on his face, tried to call out to them. His face became even more disappointed and he sadly said that he wasn't done yet, and they had already left. Seon and Jae-won started walking towards gate number 5. Jae-won said that it seemed like everyone had already gone inside a long time ago, and they were taking too long. Seon answered him that it shouldn't be a problem for them since there was no time limit to complete the mission. Behind them in the distance, a guy with a swimming lap was running in the distance and asking them to take him with them. Seon looked at the walls of the maze and said they were much larger than he thought. He guessed that their approximate height was about 30 meters. Jae-won, who was walking beside him, asked if he realized that after only taking one look at them. Seon laughed awkwardly and said that it was just a habit of his. The guy in the swimming suit continued to chase after them, weaving tiredly in their direction. Jae-won told Seon that it was quite a useful habit, then asked how they planned to find the spheres in such a huge maze. Seon pointed in the direction with his hand and suggested that the spheres were hidden behind the rocks that were to that side. The guy in the swimming suit was trying to shorten the distance between them, but it was obvious that he was running with his last strength. He was breathing hard and covered in sweat. He asked again to be taken with him, saying he was much stronger than he looked. A gunshot rang out on the grounds, scaring all the birds away. They took off over one of the towers of the maze. There was smoke coming from someone's black gun after the shot. A group of 3 men were standing at a distance from a suspicious-looking group of people, one of whom had fired at them. In the first group, one man was lying on the ground, probably the one who had been shot. A man in a green sweatshirt standing next to him said that they should be looking for a way out of the maze and the bandits didn't need to do that. Standing next to him was a man holding a lilac ukulele in his hand. The bandit with a gun in his hand said that the fewer contestants there were, the better the chance that their group would win. Their group included a huge thug with a stone axe in his hands, a very fat man, an unknown purple long creature, and a guy with a spear. At the head of them was a guy with a gun with a scar on his face. He shouted to the players that he advised them to get ready, for it was time for them to wake up. Several gunshots were heard in the walls of the maze not far from the tower. Seon heard the sounds but didn't realize what it was. He asked Jae-won with a slightly worried face if he heard it, but Jae-won put his hands behind his head and said to just ignore it. He assumed it was just another squabble over someone not being put on the team. They came to a fork in the maze and Jae-won said that this was where the paths already diverged. Meanwhile, the guy in the swimming suit had almost caught up with them. Jae-won made a pensive face, his bangs twisting again. He said that he had heard that the first decision was the most important. Seon turned around and said as that stylist approached them. The guy in the swimming suit finally stopped and tried to catch his breath. He looked at the guys with a sparkling gaze, being brimming with confidence. He stood in a defiantly proud pose and started to talk about how he was outshining someone out there. But Jae-won interrupted him. Jae-won said that they should turn right and called Seon with him, then walked forward. Seon looked at the stylist perplexed. He told Jae-won that the Stiliaga had something to say, but Jae-won asked him to ignore him, reasoning that many dogs here like to bark but not bite. These words left the stylist puzzled. He made his face as serious as possible, frowning and tightening his lips. He jumped sharply into the air, which surprised Seon, and asked Jae-won, who was trying to ignore him, if he really thought he would give up so easily. The guy landed right in front of him. Seon stood there with his mouth open in surprise, while Jae-won still showed complete indifference. The guy straightened up after landing and pointed at them with his index finger. He introduced himself with the name Yi-woong, being full of enthusiasm. Yi-woong said that he was a person who never gave up and also a person with incredible strength. Jae-won looked at him as if Yi-woong had said something stupid, and Seon was embarrassed and confused by such an emotional introduction. Yi-woong was disappointed by their reactions, expecting something else. He started sweating from embarrassment and shaking his head. He asked what was wrong and said that there was no need to be so surprised. Seon, still with the same confused expression, pointed his finger in the opposite direction and said to look over there. Yi-woong started to turn his head there, asking if they saw a ghost or something. However, he saw someone's body starting to vaporize. Jae-won and Seon's faces took on that look far from Yi-woong's introduction, but because of the 3 corpses that had been shot by the bandits before. Seeing this, Yi-woong twitched and cried out in fright. He asked with a worried and anxious face if they were dead and what happened here. Jae-won frowned slightly and said that they seemed to have been put down recently. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to a rock standing not far from the victims. He noticed some sort of movement there. The guy exhaled tiredly, smiled and said sarcastically that they were just having a great start to the mission. Seon stood nearby and listened to him anxiously. As the bodies of the dead disappeared and vaporized, a caustic, villainous laughter was heard. The boys didn't realize what was happening. Seon shouted fearfully that there was someone there, and Yi-woong ordered them to show themselves immediately, feeling panicked. Jae-won watched all of this with an indifferent face. From behind a rock, a guy with a scar over his left eye appeared. He had shoulder-length black hair and swarthy skin. He came out of hiding completely and said that it wouldn't take long. He was wearing a black sweatshirt adorned with fur and jean shorts. His gang also began to emerge from their hiding places. From behind a rock came a thug with a stone axe, a helmet with stone horns on his head, and behind a tree stood a guy with a beard and red hair styled upwards. They and the rest of the gang, including a long, inhuman creature and a fat man with a huge gun on his shoulder, stood behind their leader, who had already managed to draw his gun. He started picking his little finger in his teeth and asked how many they had already caught and said that choosing this path was a great idea. Jae-won coldly looked at them and pondered. The mission might seem like an ordinary search for a way out of the maze, but in addition to that, it was necessary to search for spheres. He assumed that the bandits wanted to get rid of their competitors. The 2 groups stood opposite each other, with the bodies of the players still lying between them. The man raised his gun, pointing it at the guys, and said that it was time for them to wake up too. Yi-woong shouted to them that all they had to do was find a way out of the maze. The bandit said that they had heard that from the others and he was getting tired of it. The thug with the helmet on his head ducked down and told the leader that they were probably the last ones to enter through the 5th entrance. The leader told him that he should go and wake up the boss and told him that they were getting ready to perform. The thug walked over to one of the bodies lying on the ground and woke him up, calling him boss. The boss sat up and yawned. He asked if they were done. Seon and Yi-woong were shocked and opened their mouths wide in surprise. Their boss had been pretending to be dead all this time. The guy with the gun said that these guys were the last ones. The boss said he had taken a good nap and now he could move on. The boss looked like a young man with a small goatee and long blonde hair tied back in a high ponytail, wearing a black long sleeve and a short sleeve button-down shirt. The whole gang prepared to attack. The purple creature stretched out, increasing in height, while the others drew their weapons and giggled nastily, the guy with the gun cheekily asking how he could fry them. Yi-woong was scared the most. He was shaking with fear. Seon was also scared. His pupils were narrowed and his mouth was open. Only Jae-won alone remained calm and smiled. He crossed his arms over his chest and mockingly asked the gang boss if they could defeat them with such a small number of people. Yi-woong begged to stop provoking them. The boss grinned and said that it was amazing how they were showing off even in such a situation. Jae-won smiled at him and asked if he really thought so and said that they have a very strong guy. Seon calmed down at his words, remembering that Yi-woong used to say that about himself. Yi-woong turned around to them and smiled. He thought that he wouldn't be alone today and mentally turned to the guys, saying that he was relying on them. Jae-won pointed his index finger at Yi-woong and encouraged him, calling him an incredibly strong friend, while Seon looked at him hopefully and told him to show the bandits what he could do. Yi-woong immediately changed in his face, feeling disappointed. He thought that they would be in the fight, covering for him. The bandits stood and looked at them. Boss covered one eye and called them a bunch of fools who had just so much fueled his hope for an interesting and equal fight. The boss ordered to finish off Yi Wung for starters. All of the bandits immediately started running at him, preparing to attack. Yi Wung tried to stop them by asking them to stop and making excuses. The guy with the spear who swooped down on him from above said that it was too late. He ordered his fire spear to blaze, and the spear tip did indeed become covered in flames. Yi Wung and Xian looked at him with terror in their eyes. At this moment, an Yudavish creature with a muzzle was roaring somewhere with a mask shaped like gilded fingers. There was steam coming from its mouth. Jai-Won paid attention to the roar and looked in the direction it was coming from. Suddenly, the monster's huge hand pierced through the stone wall of the maze, knocking back the bandit with the spear, who screamed desperately. Xian looked at the monster, frowning. A huge minotaur appeared from behind the wall, wearing a golden mask on its face, whose end looked like human fingers. The minotaur completely destroyed the wall through which it made its way to the player's battlefield. Yi Wung was grabbing his head while being completely confused, and Jai-Won was already grabbing his umbrella hanging behind his back. The boss took a step back and asked what this was all about. His henchmen started shaking with fear and said that the monster had broken through the wall. Xian said in shock that the minotaur was at least 100 meters tall. Yi Wung lowered his head, grabbing his head. He started shaking with laughter. Suddenly, he raised his head and made a crazy expression on his face. The guy asked everyone why they thought the minotaur had appeared so suddenly. The enemies asked if it was a summoning while the minotaur's hoof was standing next to them. The boss asked if this guy was really that strong. Xian gave Yi Wung a thumbs up and said that it was cool. Yi Wung in turn said that he is a man who has good luck. Jai-Won raised his head looking at the minotaur and asked if he really thought so. He said to look at the minotaur and asked if it was strange. They all lifted their heads up and began to look at the monster. They noticed the minotaur's right eye. It was shining strangely. Xian took a closer look and realized that it wasn't an eye. It was actually a sphere that was needed to complete the mission. This dream world is made up of cubes and test zones. At the same time, several tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of players dive into different levels of the cube. Those who strive into the depths of this cube are called cubers. The cube had 9 cells in height, 9 in width and 9 in length, and the total number of cells was 729. The cubes were distributed in height, length, and width respectively. The cube numbered 2i2 was on the second cell in length, the first cell in height, and the second cell in length. Within the cubes themselves are various missions. Sometimes the rules are almost non-existent. The minotaur stood behind the guys, showing all its power and strength. Jai-Won said that at the very beginning, the judges announced that there were 16 spheres scattered around the maze, but they didn't name the sizes or colors of the spheres anyway. Xian looked in his direction and started to speculate what Jai-Won meant, but Jai-Won, without even listening to him, had already replied that he had understood him correctly. He said that this beast could not have been summoned by anyone. What he said made Yi Wung's body shiver and he realized that his bluff had been exposed. The bandit angrily asked him how he dared to trick them, but Yi Wung only awkwardly scratched the back of his head and looked away. He replied that he had never actually said he had summoned him. A bulky guy ran up to the minotaur-downed guy. He started screaming in despair, thinking he was about to die, and the wounded guy with the spear told him to stop yelling in his ear. Tears ran down the thug's cheeks and he decided to get revenge on the minotaur. A crust of ice appeared on the soles of his shoes. He used an ability called Ice Charge, after which he rushed forward towards the minotaur's hooves thanks to the glide the ice gave him. The thug swung his axe and shouted that he would chop his legs to pieces. He didn't have time to run up and attack the monster. He was knocked in midair by the monster's tail. He coughed and dropped his axe from his hands and his helmet flew off his head. The minotaur pushed the thug with his tail straight into the wall. One of the thugs grabbed his head in despair and screamed, while the boss opened his mouth in shock, not expecting the minotaur to attack him with its tail. Yi Wung and Xian stood stunned at what they saw, and Jai-Won tensed up. The minotaur raised its head up and roared menacingly. It looked very threatening and dangerous. The bandit with the gun told the boss that the monster was stronger than they thought. The boss tensed up and said how big the minotaur was after all. The boss raised his hand and pointed at the monster, saying that it would be an easy victory for them. He ordered his subordinates to go on the attack. The fat guy pulled the rope and a projectile flew out of his gun. The guy with the gun started shooting, and the purple creature started stretching again. All of their attacks immediately started hitting the minotaur's head, causing it to start screaming. Xian's eyes widened at what he saw. He opened his mouth and seemed to freeze in place. It both frightened and excited him at the same time. He realized how missions in the cube actually went. The left side of the minotaur's face had been attacked. The skin on his cheek was peeled off, and it was smoking. It could be seen that the Minotaur's left eye was sewn shut, and it was missing an eyeball. The fat man exclaimed that it was a direct hit and told the boss that the monster had stopped moving. The Minotaur did indeed stand still while its face and torso smoked. The bandit with the gun laughed and haughtily said that this monster turned out to be not scary at all. The fat man agreed with him, saying that it was, and smiled. He had a chicken leg in his hand, which he had already taken a bite of. In the Minotaur's right eye socket was still a sphere that shimmered yellow and green, glinting in the sun. Sion, frozen in stupor, only wanted to say that the monster was still alive as it suddenly crushed the fat man with its tail. The bandit with the gun and the purple creature looked on in shock. The next victim was the purple creature itself, which the Minotaur grabbed with its hand. He crushed it mercilessly, and all that was left of the creature was purple spray. The bandit shook with horror and hopelessness. He squealed pitifully and asked the boss what they should do next, saying that they had no men left at all. The boss clenched his fists and lowered his head. At their feet lay the remains from the creature. Boss covered one eye and coughed. Yi Wung started to slowly walk backward, saying that they should have gotten out of here. Sion anxiously yelled out that they were all dead. The Minotaur turned to see the bandit with the gun, whose name was Bong, and the boss. Boss opened the system window and started the purge button. At this time Bong was grabbing his head, not knowing what they should do next. Bong started reloading his gun and shouted to the boss that they should avenge their comrades. The boss had a blue patterned pouch in his hands and called Bong by name. He said they were leaving. A veil of smoke appeared around them. Bong asked if the boss wanted to give up now, pointing a finger at him, and the boss asked what else they should do. He said he wouldn't mind dealing with the monster here himself, but he needed time to summon some item. Bong angrily asked why he still wasn't ready. The whole time they were surrounded by smoke that hid them from the Minotaur's gaze. The boss exhaled and ordered Bong to tell their allies to take a break in the gray area. Bong was filled with rage and shouted that this was why he hated summoning items. They both ran off into the distance. Sion, Yi Wung, and Jaiwon watched this, after which the latter asked if summoning items should recharge before using them. Sion was mortified as he realized that they were left alone with the intimidating bull. Jaiwon said that the faction boss definitely knows how to take care of his hide. At this time, Yi Wung quietly and unnoticed by the others started to run away from the battle scene. He said that since they didn't want to run away, he could do it himself. Suddenly, the Minotaur abruptly turned around while looking at him. His system saw the movements of Yi Wung, who was blue in his interface, unlike Sion and Jaiwon. Several system windows appeared, motion detected, target captured. The fleeing Yi Wung saw this and squealed. He shouted that they were all doomed and didn't understand why he was looking at him. Sion saw it too and got scared, and Jaiwon rolled his eyes. He unclipped the handle from his umbrella and said how much everything pissed him off. He added that he had hoped for an easy victory, but there was no way he expected the sphere to end up here out of all possible places. The Minotaur turned around and looked directly at them and breathed heavily, releasing smoke from its mouth and nose. Jaiwon confidently stood directly in front of him. In his left hand was the umbrella itself, and in his right hand was the handle from it. Yi Wung, on the other hand, could not calm down in any way, being gripped by panic and anxiety. He was running from side to side and trying to remind himself that this was just a dream and he was just dreaming for real. Jaiwon looked at the Minotaur's menacing face and told him that he was too arrogant for some piece of meat. He asked how dare the monster look down on him. His face became crazy. His eyes seemed to be on fire. Sion and Yi Wung watched this, and the latter asked if Jaiwon was stronger than he looked. Jaiwon looked at the handle of the umbrella and a strip of charge and its amount in percent appeared on it. The charge was 48%. He said that he couldn't fully realize his strength because of the low charge. The guy confidently walked towards the monster. He brought the hilt up to its face, which at this time had already started to be covered in lightning. Jaiwon said that it would be enough to cook a small beef. The Minotaur reached out with its huge three-fingered hand towards Jaiwon, who had no intention of running away. Sion and Yi Wung on the other hand started screaming in fear and staggered backwards. The Minotaur struck the place where Jaiwon was with his palm, but the guy managed to jump back at the last moment. Then he landed near a rock and from there he jumped to a tree to jump away from it directly to the monster's head. Sion looked at him in amazement and said that he was very fast. The frightening Minotaur noticed the guy and turned its head towards him. He raised his tail, demolishing everything in his path, and tried to knock Jaiwon in the air as he flew towards him. He placed his umbrella in front of him, his body beginning to be covered in electricity. Jaiwon repelled the attack with his umbrella with his tail, then pushed him away. The guys started to admire his skills, but then Yi Wung shouted that if Jaiwon fell, it would be over for them. Sion shouted that he was already falling. They were both very scared and anxious. Jae-won was falling straight towards the Minotaur, who was preparing to attack again. The guy looked at the hilt of his umbrella and said that it would be a shame if the sphere fried along with that carcass. He needed to reduce the damage. He pressed the button under the screen and began to gradually reduce the power of the device. Jae-won picked up the right power, and the Minotaur at this time was already ready to grab him with its palm. Suddenly, the monster squeezed his palm. Yi-woong and Seon shockedly looked at all this and thought that it was all over and they too would be grabbed. But then the Jae-won sitting inside the Minotaur's fist decided to use the electric charge ability. He looked very calm and maintained his composure. He started on the button of his device, preparing to attack. The charge percentage dropped from 48 to 31. As soon as Jae-won used the ability, the Minotaur's body was immediately covered in electricity, and a wave of current passed through it. Smoke with a burning odor began to emanate from the bull's entire body. It opened its mouth and stuck its tongue out. The Minotaur weakened and unclenched its fist from where Jae-won landed safely on the ground. The bull's fur looked as if it had been burned. It had darkened noticeably. Jae-won hoped it wouldn't leave a burning smell on his clothes, after which he sniffed his shirt squeamishly. Yi-woong praised the guy and said that it was incredible, and that he slew the Minotaur with just one attack. Jae-won didn't reply anything and tucked his umbrella back behind his back. Yi-woong smugly ran a hand through his hair and said that he was sorry he didn't have time to join in, and he really wanted to. It was obvious that he kept lying so that his image wouldn't be ruined. Seon raised his head and was stunned at what he saw. The Minotaur was still alive and approaching them, growling menacingly. Jae-won turned around and asked disappointedly how he was still alive. He looked at the hilt of his umbrella, which still had 31% charge left on it. He asked how the monster could stand on its feet after something like that. The Minotaur stared at them fiercely as the charge residue from Jae-won's attack continued to run through its body. He assumed that he had a pretty good defense against electricity, after which he irritably said that it pissed him off. The guy angrily looked at the monster and said that since 17% wasn't enough, he would just increase the power. He took the handle off the umbrella again and pressed the button, preparing to attack. He said that there would be no more indulgences. His entire body was electrified and glowed with a bright blue light. Lightning started to approach the Minotaur with his large and agile jumps. Seon confusedly asked if they should help him, to which Yi-woong awkwardly replied that he would love to help, but unfortunately, he had a set of defense plus detection, so he would be useless here. Seon looked at the guy questioningly. He remembered Ririn asking him to choose 2 of the 5 abilities presented before the mission. The choices were damage, dexterity, detection, defense, and recovery, and the item would be selected based on the player's choices. Seon remembered that he had chosen damage and wondered if he would be given a weapon and how he could summon it. Seon tensed up and started trying to summon the item the way he did in his dreams, by simply commanding his weapon to appear. Yi-woong looked at him incomprehensibly and asked if he was conjuring there. The guy realized that the weapon wouldn't just appear. He remembered how the girl he had met earlier had pulled a paper and pencil out of some black cavity, and then put them away. He realized that the people in the clock tower were also summoning and using their system windows with a certain command, the name of which Seon still had no way of remembering. The Minotaur pushed away with its tail Jae-won, who was preparing to attack him, and the guy fell to the ground. Seon turned to Yi-woong and asked him how he could summon that black thing, referring to the system window. Yi-woong, on the other hand, was carefully dodging the pieces of wall flying at him and asked if Seon had to ask that right now since he was actually a bit busy. Jae-won said irritably that electricity was useless, and Yi-woong, who was still dodging, asked him what they should do. Jae-won replied that there was nothing left for them to do but run. The guys started running as far away as they could from the Minotaur, which was trying to crush them with its huge arms. They turned a corner, but that didn't help them and the Minotaur spotted them, starting to chase them. While the guys were running, there was a small verbal altercation between Yi-woong and Jae-won. Yi-woong asked Jae-won to do something since he was so strong, and Jae-won told him that he could if he had a 100% charge. He sarcastically asked Yi-woong if he was boasting about how strong he was. The latter replied to him that he was a bit out of shape today. Seon turned back in horror and looked at the Minotaur. He ordered everyone to jump forward, for the Minotaur was preparing to attack them with its powerful tail, but missed thanks to their quick reaction. Yi-woong started squealing in fear and shouted that the monster would make mincemeat out of them and that they should have run from the start. Seon looked straight ahead and noticed something. They started to run up to a fork and they had the choice of running straight or turning right. Seon asked which way they should go, and at that time an idea popped into Yi-woong's head. He smirked and said that he was capable of doing a lot of things when he wanted to. He told the others that he had a great plan. Seon turned around and interrogated him, and Jae-won asked if he meant the path. Yi-woong pulled his goggles over his eyes with a sly smile on his face. He looked at his allies and said that he is a man who never loses and they can rely on him. He gave them a thumbs up. They continued to run further away from the Minotaur that tried to attack them with its tail time after time. Jae-won turned around and looked at it and realized that the monster was mindlessly smashing everything in their path. He wondered if this monster even had a mind. He skeptically asked what kind of plan Yi-woong had come up with, whereupon he pointed his index finger forward and said that it was simple. He asked them to look at the big tree that stood in front of them. He ordered them to jump on it as high as possible at his signal. Seon said confusedly that the tree was huge after all. It was indeed big. It had a thick trunk and a thick crown, and it was about 10 or 15 meters tall. Jae-won asked irritably if he really had such a plan, to which Yi-woong said to just trust him, because he always keeps his word. He opened the system window. Seon without a second thought asked if he should just jump on that tree, to which Yi-woong winked at him and answered positively, then told him to trust him. The Minotaur slapped the wall with his tail and whole chunks started to fall off. Jae-won looked at this irritatedly and angrily asked Yi-woong when he would give them the signal already. The guy corrected his glasses and asked him to wait a bit, for they were still too far away. Seon said fearfully that they were almost there, but Jae-won opened his umbrella and took cover from the wall debris falling on him. Yi-woong concentrated, estimating the distance, and said that they should run a little closer. At this time, the Minotaur curved its tail so that it began to resemble more of a curved sting. Seon anxiously turned around and asked the others if they thought the Minotaur had changed somehow. Jae-won answered him that perhaps by curling its tail, it wanted to increase the accuracy of its attacks. The Minotaur had already aimed its tail and was about to attack. Jae-won said that it was quite dangerous. Yi-woong smiled and said that this distance would be enough for them while looking at the system window. Through the system window, he activated an item called a mini springboard. He raised his head forward and smiled. A small trampoline materialized in front of the guys and Yi-woong ordered them to jump. He and Jae-won jumped off of it and pushed themselves towards a tree. Immediately after, the Minotaur destroyed the mini trampoline, but luckily everyone managed to jump. Yi-woong looked at the system window again, then activated two items, the ever-bouncing ball and the super-powerful extra bomb. As they reached the tree, Jae-won said that even though they managed to bounce back, he didn't understand what the guy was going to do with all that useless stuff. Yi-woong had a ball and a pouch in his hands. He replied that the items were his specialty. He decided to use his flower smoke bomb first, squeezing the pouch containing it tighter. Suddenly the crown of the tree and the boys disappeared behind the smoke screen. The Minotaur stopped, not realizing where they had disappeared to. He looked at the tree, but his system couldn't pick up anyone, as indicated by the system windows. Attempted target acquisition. Target not found. Then, Yi-woong used his ever-bouncing ball, throwing a green-colored ball towards the monster. The ball appeared out of the smoke screen, which then attracted the Minotaur's attention. Yi-woong explained that this ball bounces until all the air is blown away. The Minotaur ran after the bouncing ball, completely forgetting about the guys. Jae-won was surprised by this. He watched the Minotaur moving away from them in the distance and wondered if the springboard, the ball, and the flower bomb should be sold in the check area. He wondered what kind of moron would decide to buy all that junk. He shifted his gaze to Yi-woong hanging from a branch using a swimming lap. He realized he was now looking at the moron who had bought all this stuff. Yi-woong at the same time exhaled and wiped the sweat from his forehead, happy that they were able to survive. The branch he was hanging on began to gradually crack. It finally snapped and the guy fell to the ground with a scream, hitting his face. Jae-won, on the other hand, opened his umbrella and used it to land softly. Yi-woong, who was lying on the ground, asked Jae-won how he felt about his plan. The latter only sarcastically said that sometimes even worms can be useful. Yi-woong took out a small chest and a mud bomb from his inventory and started boasting about having other items such as a mud bomb and a surprise bomb. He wanted to continue listing the items he had, but he was interrupted by Jae-won who asked where Seon was. He asked if he was still in the tree and shouted to the guy that he could go down already. Seon climbed out of the thick foliage of the tree at the very top and said he was here. He was asked how he got so high, to which Seon laughed nervously and said he was probably just nervous. Jae-won remembered that moment when they were jumping up the tree. He's pretty sure he saw the way Seon jumped before he touched the springboard. While he and Yi-woong had only pushed off, Seon had already flown up to the tree. He wondered how he managed to jump so high, since he couldn't tell he was exerting much effort. Seon jumped down from the tree and landed neatly in a squat. Yi-woong began to feel proud of himself and asked the guys if they should thank him, a man with a noble heart. Seon smiled sincerely at him and said that he was just overwhelmed. Jae-won on the other hand remained silent, looking at Seon with a smile, and thinking that it was quite an interesting ability. Seon made a thoughtful face and remarked that this tailed minotaur really liked that ball and acted like a dog. Seon's wording made Jae-won a little confused. Yi-woong, on the other hand, began to speculate why the minotaur was acting like that. He said that it wasn't really about the ball, and he was just sensitive to moving objects. He realized this when he started to run away quietly, and the monster started looking at him right at that very moment. Seon was surprised and asked how he guessed that, and Jae-won told him that he probably just said it randomly. Those words made Yi-woong angry, and he angrily said that he was studying his characterization. Jae-won smirked and repeated his line about how sometimes even worms are useful. Yi-woong got even angrier and asked what that meant. Jae-won called him a worm again, and Seon questioningly repeated the nickname. At this time, there were 3 people standing on the wall watching him. A girl in a red tracksuit with hair ears named Rin asked what kind of bunch of wimps they were. Her co-commander named Damon, who wore massive armor and a helmet with a transparent mask, said that this was the first floor, the lowest level of the cube, and obviously the people here were weak. The third man in their group opened the lighter cap and said that Damon was right. That person was a young guy with a patch over his left eye, wearing a short-sleeved sweatshirt with a hood. He was squatting and holding a red orb in addition to a lighter. He said that these guys would get stronger in time. Rin frowned resentfully and crossed her arms over her chest. The guy with the eye patch grabbed the sphere tighter and said they shouldn't be discouraged. They looked ahead, and the guy said this was only the beginning. Behind them, down below, a dead minotaur lay covered in blue liquid, and the wall next to it was dented. The hair on Jae-won's head shook again. He lifted his head up and looked at the wall. He felt as if someone was watching them. He decided he was just imagining things. Seon asked if there was anything on the wall, to which Jae-won calmly said there was nothing there. He asked Seon if he had noticed anything interesting while he was at the top of that tree. Seon thought for a moment and then said that the walls were higher than the top of the tree, so he didn't get to see much. But he did notice that there was black smoke coming from several places. In 3 places in the middle of the labyrinth, 3 columns of dense and acrid smoke were rising into the air. Jae-won thoughtfully said that most likely the other participants were fighting amongst themselves, or they were hunting a minotaur. Yi-woong started giggling and asked if they were accidentally barbecuing in there. He made a smarmy expression and pointed his finger back. He said that thanks to his brilliant plan, the minotaur ran off in that direction, through the trees. Jae-won said with a thoughtful expression on his face that out of 328 participants, only 16 would be able to accomplish the mission by getting the spheres, and asked where they could be. Yi-woong reminded him that one of the spheres was in the minotaur's right eye. Seon pointed out that there were no more spheres on his body except for the one hidden in his eye socket. Yi-woong suggested with horror in his voice that thus, as many spheres as there were minotaurs, there were 16 ferocious monsters roaming the labyrinth ready to kill everyone in their path. Apparently, all the spheres were also hidden in their eye sockets. Yi-woong grabbed his head while being confused. He shouted that there were no cubers here that could overpower them. But after all, this was a 2x2 cube and it was one of the lowest ranked zones. These words made Seon tense up, but Jae-won continued to remain calm and cool. He smiled and asked if Yi-woong really thought so. He agreed that the level of this cube was low, but today's mission was rather unusual. Explosions continued to sound in the walls of the maze, and smoke continued to waft into the sky. The bloody eye of a minotaur showed itself. A player wearing a hood that hid his face was holding a shotgun that was emitting smoke from the shot, and he was also holding a blue orb that shimmered beautifully in the sun. The player stood on a huge stone axe with a wooden handle and looked at the corpse of a giant minotaur that lay nearby. The player said that this monster appeared to be pretty tough. In another part of the maze, the red minotaur took a step that echoed with a rumble. The orb in its right eye glowed ominously with a red light. A werewolf next to the minotaur held another red sphere in its large paws and gazed at it happily. The beautiful lady in the hat the boys had seen before was holding a green sphere in her hand. She turned her attention to the approaching minotaur and told her partner named Hayden that they were leaving the monster to him. Hayden looked like a young man with red hair slicked up. The top of his face had green skin sewn onto the rest of his face. It looked like a mask. He was dressed in an elegant suit and held a glass of wine in his hand. He covered his eyes slightly and looked at the monster. In an instant, the minotaur was already cut in half and Hayden rushed down. He landed neatly, placing his piano sword on the ground. Behind him, the Minotaur's breathless, slashed body collapsed, sending a powerful stream of wind in the guy's direction. He grinned irritably and said it wasn't enough, he was bored so much. Suddenly, the wall was broken through by a giant hand. It was an iron giant that threw down its enemies it killed. It broke the wall completely and went straight through. Hayden noticed this as well. He stuck his tongue out, licking his tongue, and said that it should be more fun by now. A chicken judge appeared next to the iron giant and announced that 1 hour had passed from the start of the mission. He also added that only 68 of the 328 contestants were left, and one of the contestants had already completed the mission, as evidenced by the screen on his body that said 1 out of 16. Sion asked in surprise, saying that someone had already finished. Jae-won asked the guys if they should hurry up too. He started walking in the direction where the monster was going. Sion tried to stop him by saying that's where the Minotaur went. Jae-won asked what was wrong. Sion worriedly asked back if it was dangerous there. Jae-won smiled and answered him positively, but said it was better than letting other groups of cubers ambush them. He remembered the time they had crossed paths with the bandits. Jae-won covered his eyes and said that since the Minotaur had rushed there, smashing everything in its path, they wouldn't meet any other cubers. Sion didn't think about it, so he immediately calmed down and said that the guy was right. Yi-woong grinned and said that he had thought about it too. The two of them ran towards the Minotaur's location, shouting about being first and running forward towards the safe zone. Jae-won on the other hand took out his umbrella and looked at the amount of charge in the handle. He said he needed time to recharge. He said that in any case, the Minotaur had really wreaked havoc and turned towards the broken wall. The other walls of the labyrinth were also a bit broken, with dents in them, and the monster's hoofprints were visible on the ground. Everything around them was in smoke. Jae-won looked towards a small body of water to the right of the broken wall, and said that they should go that way. Yi-woong stopped and pointed his finger at the hole in the wall, and reminded Jae-won that it would be safer to follow the Minotaur. The latter just relaxed and put his hands behind his head and walked forward, telling the guy that he wasn't forcing him to follow them and he could go his own way. These words made Yi-woong angry and he viciously cursed towards Jae-won. The blue water in the pond glistened beautifully in the sun. It was obvious that someone was about to swim out of it. He rushed upwards with a joyous exclamation, splashing Sion from head to toe. It was Yi-woong, who was now lying relaxedly on the water with the help of his swimming lap. Sion, on the other hand, was shivering squeamishly from the water that had wet his clothes. Yi-woong told the guys that they should take a break too, but he didn't know that there were predatory piranhas with sharp teeth swimming in the body of water. Sion turned to Jae-won and asked what he meant when he called this mission unusual. The guy turned to him and asked him to forget about it like it was something insignificant. He calmly said that it was only that the mission itself was quite different from ordinary missions. Those words shocked Yi-woong, who jumped up a bit and loudly asked if the guy wanted to mention that it was an event mission. There were water droplets running down his face. He asked if the event missions were the ones where all the strongest cubers gathered. He pictured 3 mysterious silhouettes of players in his head. He said that such missions could win really valuable prizes, and this in turn attracted terrifyingly strong players like Forest Witch, Cliff, or Tricolored Demon. Jae-won smugly fixed the hair on his head and said that they were all on the 2nd floor, so they wouldn't be able to join the 1st floor mission. But sometimes strong guys like him would appear in places like this. Those words made Yi-woong angry, so he told Jae-won that he wouldn't even defeat a low-level monster. Because of this, tension began to build up between them and they exchanged barbs and hurtful nicknames. Sion awkwardly scratched the back of his head, and to defuse the situation, he said that he had a question. He scratched his forehead and asked if event missions last longer than normal missions. Jae-won turned to him and said that they probably do. He explained that it usually depends on the mission itself, but more often than not they do take longer than standard missions. He asked the guy what was up and if he was in a hurry to get somewhere. Sion scratched the back of his head again and embarrassedly said that he actually had to meet someone in Cube 2I1 at 10 o'clock, then laughed awkwardly. Yi-woong smiled smugly and said that it sounded interesting. He assumed it was supposed to be a meeting with a lady. Sion asked in surprise how he knew that, and Jae-won opened the system window. He said the clock showed 8:16 p.m., and if his meeting was scheduled at 10 p.m., he still had time. Yi-woong mockingly said that it's not good to keep people waiting and continued splashing around in the water. Sion was surprised that the clock only showed 8:16 p.m., since the judges had announced to them that a whole hour had already passed. A drop of sweat was dripping on his face, and his eyes were wide open. Jae-won gave him a friendly smile and remembered that this was the guy's first mission and decided to explain it to him. But instead Yi-woong spoke up with enthusiasm and raised his index finger up. He explained that in all the cells of the cube, except for the gray area, time flowed slower than in the real world. Here, everything was slowed down 6 times. A total of 16 minutes had passed, while in the dream world it equaled 1 hour and 36 minutes. Jae-won angrily and irritatedly looked at Yi-woong, who was cackling nastily, and asked how he dared to interrupt him. He asked Seon how come he arrived 2 hours before the meeting without even knowing it. He awkwardly exhaled and tried to start explaining it, but suddenly he sadly lowered his gaze down. A cheer went up in his head, ahead of people calling him a hero. He remembered his last dream on Mystic Island, where he was in the role of the Frogman. People were standing around his tower then and cheering, calling him the Frog Hero and rejoicing at his appearance. He smiled radiantly at them as he stood at the top of the tower, and people fanatically told each other to look at him. Then he remembered seeing a list of items at the bar back then. Among them was precisely his dream with Mystic Island, with a note saying that it was a novelty, and its value was 1,000 dream points. He had to return it. This was the place where he belonged. That was why he wordlessly pulled the handle of the door that appeared in the bar and made his way in. Seon awkwardly looked away and told Jae-won that he was a little impatient, and the thing was that he wanted his dream back very badly. Jae-won and Yi-woong raised their eyebrows up and opened their mouths in surprise, caught off guard. Seon didn't understand their reactions and asked what was wrong. Jae-won shockedly asked if he was participating in the mission without even getting his sleep back. Seon smiled embarrassedly and said that he was. He didn't even realize what was wrong, thinking everything was normal, and asked what was wrong and what he was doing wrong. Jae-won calmed down a bit and asked if the guy was aware that if he died in the cube, he would never get his dream back again. Realized dreams, intertwined dreams, and absolutely every memory associated with this place would be erased from his head forever, and he would never sink into sleep again. Seon imagined his island crumbling into small pieces. Jae-won said that if they had known about it beforehand, they might have been able to protect themselves from those flying black holes that forced them into the cube. Seon lowered his gaze and said that he knew how risky it all was, but he had no choice but to put everything on the line because he needed to earn 1,000 dream points. Jae-won put his fist to his chin and said with a pensive face that although the cubes are designed to complete missions and earn dream points, it's not a place to take risks. The people who came here had their dreams back beforehand, and Seon shouldn't have come here at all, considering the danger he was putting himself in. Seon felt as if he was twitching at the information he had heard and for the first time thought about it. He asked if there were safer ways to earn dream points. Jae-won answered him positively, as if it was something he took for granted, and told him that there was a special training area in the 1i1 cube. It looked like an archway that had a sign with gears on it. One of the players walked out of there, happy that he had finally saved up, and another player tearfully said that he was jealous of him. Jae-won said that it was quite common for people to collect all 1,000 dream points in this training area. He looked the other way with a thoughtful face and said that the dream points might be slowly accumulating there, but at least they wouldn't have to risk anything. Yi-woong, still floating in the water, creased his face at the memory of it and said that it took him a whole year. The curl on Jae-won's head took the shape of a question mark, and the guy himself asked if the manager had told Seon about it. He furrowed his eyebrows and gritted his teeth as he remembered the manager who had gotten caught. That girl had been drunk and hadn't even bothered to explain half of what he should have known. Seon asked Jae-won if he meant by Cube 1i1 that place with the big clock. He answered him in the affirmative and told him that they also called that place the Gray Zone. Seon remembered his being there where he had met many players. He realized that there he could safely collect all the dream points he needed. He remembered again the girl who had helped him through the first mission and how she had suggested meeting in the Cube 2i1. Seon didn't understand why she hadn't told him about it, which made him sink into panic and confusion. Seon was immersed in memories from elementary school. His classmates were whispering among themselves. One of them said that both of the boys' parents had died in some incident. Another told him that and asked if Seon was all alone. His classmate asked him to keep his voice down so that Seon would not hear them. The boy himself was sitting alone at his desk with his head sullenly down. He was wearing a dull-colored sweater and black pants. His classmates continued to discuss the incident. Many said it could have been murder, but someone asked if it was due to arson. The boy heard all this, but didn't answer them anything. Suddenly someone approached him and put a hand on his shoulder. This surprised Seon. Besides, this person told him not to be sad. He raised his head in surprise and looked at that person's face. The kids immediately started whispering. It was the head of the class. They were saying that the girl was worried even about someone like him. The headmistress wore blue glasses and was wearing a pink sweater. Seon thought about people meddling and committing petty crimes. He had always known that all people acted only for personal gain. Sion realized that the headmistress never really cared about him. She only used him to look better in the eyes of others. Sion continued to stand there thinking about it with a sad face. Jae-won put his hand on his shoulder. He told him not to worry so much and that he was very lucky. He smiled softly at Sion. Yi-woong narcissistically fixed his hair and said that Sion was lucky in that he had him, Mr. Yi-woong, and he would help him complete this mission, so Sion could not worry. Sion shifted his gaze to one of the walls of the maze. There was only one question in his mind. He asked the guys why they wanted to help him. After all, this was his battle. He stood with his back to them and said that they had nothing to lose and he would only be in their way. Sion looked very gloomy. Jae-won slightly turned his head in his direction and asked if he looked like someone who had a lot of free time. He made a serious face and said that he didn't help people if he didn't get anything out of it. Most of all, he hated taking risks. He said that even if Sion wasn't happy with it, he would still be useful to him still on this mission. Sion's eyes widened and his pupils narrowed. Jae-won smiled and closed his eyes. He said that he was already getting bored anyway. Yi-woong continued to relax in the water. Jae-won's words about boredom surprised Sion. He asked if that was the reason he decided to help him. He looked a little confused, but was glad for the honest answer. Yi-woong opened one eye, smiled and thought that Sion was quite shy, actually. Jae-won, who was walking forward, waved at Sion and said that if he didn't go with him, he would leave him behind. Sion turned around to look at him. He had a surprised look on his face and didn't know what to reply. While Jae-won relaxedly walked forward, Yi-woong started swimming forward and said that the further they went, the more fun they had. There were predatory piranhas swimming below him the whole time. They noticed the guy swimming by and it was as if they were angry. They all rushed toward him, getting ready to bite him. They targeted his back, whereupon Yi-woong felt a terrible pain. He opened his eyes so wide that his eyeballs felt like they were about to fall out. He screamed furiously. It was so loud that even a chicken flying in the sky heard it and chirped questioningly. The chicken judges flew over the huge maze and announced that 1 hour and 43 minutes had passed. They also said that there were only 38 contestants left out of 328. After what time they announced that 4 contestants had already passed the challenge. The 3 players walked through the translucent barrier to the finish area. There were the same blocks as in the arena where Sion got in first. A green-colored chicken in the finish area announced that if someone had already found the orb, they still needed to exit the maze to complete the mission. A furry paw crossed the barrier. It was the bunny girl Rin, who immediately started cheering and jumping up and down. She was rejoicing at the fact that she had won first place. Behind her, her 2 co-teammates, Damon in armor and the guy with the eye patch, came over the barrier. The green chicken told them that the spheres were confirmed and they needed to wait for their places to be announced. Damon called out to Rin and told her that she wasn't the one who took first place and pointed towards the colorful blocks. Rin's hair ears perked up and she frowned unhappily and puffed her cheeks. On the block sat a mysterious player, head to toe clad in a purple cape that hid his face and body. In his hands he held something. Rin took offense and said it was a lame mission. The guy with the eye patch looked at the first finalist seriously. His hands looked more like claws, and in them he held a purple glowing cube. Meanwhile, Sion, Jae-won, and Yi-woong had already gone further into the maze in search of spheres and an exit. A piranha clung to the swimming circle with its teeth, and Yi-woong irritably asked what kind of creature it was. He tearfully turned around, looked at Sion and asked if his ass was okay. Sion, who was removing the predatory underwater creatures from the guy's lap and back, replied that it seemed fine. Jae-won meanwhile was looking straight ahead and noticed a fork in the road. In the background somewhere in the maze, explosions continued to rumble in the background. The guy put his fist to his chin and said thoughtfully that except for the path they came from, they had 2 more paths left. Behind one of the walls, several people were running from something as if to escape. The wall that was next to them appeared to be destroyed. Yi-woong asked if they had another path now, and Sion asked if the wall was broken. Jae-won was still thinking about those 2 paths and said they had a 50% chance. Sion, as if sensing something, tensed up and started to feel some anxiety. A gigantic spear flew out from the wall that had started to collapse, which miraculously didn't hit the guys standing in its path. They didn't even immediately realize what had just happened. The spear crashed into the ground, rolling across it. Sion shouted and started to back away, while Yi-woong held his head and asked what it was. Jae-won, on the other hand, had already reached for his umbrella. Sion turned his head when he heard someone's voices from the side where the spear had come from. 3 players were struggling to run away from something towards the guys. They were a lumberjack with a helper on his back, a girl with a red scarf and green hair, and a girl with long hair bouncing on a ball. Sion looked at them fearfully, eyes wide and mouth ajar. The girl with green hair shouted to her allies to keep running away, fleeing from the danger. The wall was finally shattered by a gray minotaur chasing after the players. He was holding the same spear that almost killed the boys, and he had 3 more of them behind him. He growled ferociously, trying to catch up with his victims. Pieces from the stone wall started flying in all directions. Sion twitched and frightened the minotaur, and Yi Wung desperately asked why he was here. Jae-won tried to keep his composure and calm. However, he realized that they were in a mess. The Minotaur was preparing to throw another spear at the players who had almost reached the guys. They ran past them, and the balloon girl with long hair told them that now it was up to them to deal with this Minotaur. Yi Wung was beyond angry. He clenched his fist and started shaking, screaming about how dare they laugh at them. Sion grabbed him and ran with him and asked him what he was doing since they had to run. A spear almost flew at them. Jae-won continued to stand still. He pulled out his umbrella and realized that it wasn't fully charged yet, but he had no choice. The 3 of them started to run away from the attacks. Yi Wung asked Jae-won to do something since he had already handled another Minotaur before. Jae-won only ordered him to shut up. Sion was very tense. He realized that he couldn't continue to rely on them and wanted to get his item that he had chosen. He asked Yi Wung how to make the black thing appear on his arm. He didn't know how to explain it, so he said it the way he knew how. Yi Wung naturally didn't understand what he meant and asked what kind of black thing he was talking about. Ahead of them, a girl was jumping on a balloon while laughing. The Minotaur had already released 3 spears. He had 2 left. He continued to chase, not stopping for a second. Sion decided to rephrase his question and asked what he should do to make him have his weapon. Yi Wung shouted that he should just say blank. The formidable Minotaur was preparing to attack them again and had his spear at the ready. It had a rod-shaped owl in its mouth with steam coming out of it and saliva dripping from its mouth itself. Sion desperately shouted the word blank. A system window with a list of his items began to appear in front of him. The Minotaur had already thrown his spear, which hit the archway above the passage they were running towards. Sion was happy that he was able to activate the system window. Yi Wung, on the other hand, at the same time asked with horror in his voice what had just happened. The stone debris began to fall down one by one. The archway completely collapsed and blocked everyone's escape route. They found themselves in a dead end. The terrifying Minotaur had already reached for his last spear. He was heavily exhaling smoke coming out of his oodles and his nose. All the players, including the guys, raised their heads in horror and didn't know what to do. Sion's gaze, however, was filled with determination. He had to use his item. System window, item, bloodroot. A red glow in the shape of wriggling ribbons began to emanate from the system window. He clicked on the item's name, then began to wait to see what would happen next. A new system window appeared. The item was equipped. All the ribbons coming from the system window disappeared. Even though the item was listed as equipped, nothing appeared and nothing changed. Sion didn't realize what had happened or if he had gotten the item. The Minotaur began to pull out a spear with an emerald tip embedded in the ground. He had already raised 2 spears and could attack them again. Sion began rummaging through his pockets, finding himself panicked and confused, deciding that his item was too small and couldn't be seen. The system window said that the item was equipped, but he couldn't spot it anywhere. The girl who was riding the balloon made a surprised face, not realizing what was going on. Sion was experiencing despair. His pupils narrowed, his right eye began to twitch, and his gaze looked empty. Cold sweat was running down his face. The Minotaur began to breathe heavily and growl muffled. Smoke began to come from his nose and nub, and the green orb in his right eye glowed brightly from within. Suddenly, he opened his mouth wide and gave a loud, ominous screech, splattering saliva. Sion looked at him very frightened and twitched at the sudden scream. He wanted to move away in the other direction, but he was yelled at not to move. The one who shouted was Jae-won. He froze in place holding the umbrella handle, then added that the monster only reacted to movements. Yi Wung also froze with a frightened expression on his face. Jae-won said that the Minotaur had lost all of its targets because of the destroyed wall. The team that had previously run away from the monster also froze in place with incomprehensible and confused faces. Jae-won looked at the charge of his weapon. It had 97% on it. He said that there were only 3 minutes left until it was fully charged. He glared menacingly at the Minotaur and asked the others to wait for 3 minutes and then they could do whatever they wanted. Jae-won was confident in himself and his strength. The Minotaur, growling muffledly, scrutinized the area in front of him. Not a single person moved in his field of vision, including no more rocks falling. Several system windows appeared in front of him, searching for targets. No targets found. Suddenly, the formidable beast turned 180 degrees and walked away. Sion stared after it. Yi Wung breathed out a sigh of relief, while Sion's face still looked very scared. One of the collapsed slabs from the archway was held on a wooden stick that had started to crack and break off. As soon as the stick broke, under the pressure of the stone slab, the rest of the cobblestones started flying around. Sion anxiously shifted his gaze in that direction. One of the stones began to fall towards Sion, rolling straight towards his feet. He cautiously turned his head to look at them. Yi-woong with a very scared and worried face ordered Sion to run away. Jae-won, who noticed this, snapped out of his seat and ran towards the guy. There was already a giant spear flying towards him that was about to kill the guy. Sion raised his head, not understanding anything. He thought that there was no way this could happen. The tip of the spear was reflected in his big red eyes. He couldn't believe that this was his end. He remembered the words of the girl who had helped him through the mission the first time. Her face was obscured by her hair and the memories, but he clearly remembered her words that if he died before he could regain his dreams, he would lose them forever, and if he wanted it all back, he must not die. The spear tip had already almost reached its target. The wind had picked up all around because of its flying speed. Sion frowned his eyebrows and gritted his teeth as he looked at the spear that was decreasing the distance between them more and more. Sion pushed off the ground, leaving dents on the ground. Jae-won and Yi-woong looked at him with their mouths open. They just couldn't believe their eyes, and also the team that had been standing beside them all this time was shocked. Sion shouted that he couldn't die before he regained his dreams. He jumped away from where the spear hit, right onto the pile of rocks that were blocking their path. He was able to avoid the attack, and the spear didn't kill him. The Minotaur raised its head angrily, reacting to the sudden movement. Sion looked down at him. He was glad that he was still alive. On the Minotaur's interface, Sion was in focus, and then a system window appeared, target detected. The Minotaur hurled a second spear at him with all its might. Sion was able to dodge this attack as well, so the spear just crashed into a pile of rocks without injuring the guy. He jumped back to the wall, then after a second he jumped away from it again. Sion started pushing off the walls, jumping higher and higher, reaching the top of the walls. Yi-woong looked at him with a smile and pride and said that he had bought a really good item. A shocked Jae-won told him that it wasn't an item at all, which made Yi-woong confused. Jae-won went on to say that once someone goes into shared memories, they get a special ability whether they want it or not. He remembered the time Sion jumped incredibly high into a tree without even using a springboard. That was his strength, his special trait. It was his innate ability. Sion jumped even higher than the walls, leaving the Minotaur below and preventing him from attacking himself. Suddenly, he twisted and came to his senses. His eyes opened wide and his pupils narrowed. He looked down in flight, not realizing what had happened. He realized that he had just used his heroic ability that he had possessed in his dreams on Mystic Island. While he was in the air, the Minotaur threw his spear at him again. Yi-woong anxiously shouted that Sion would not be able to dodge, as the spear was flying straight at him. There were only seconds left before the tip of the spear would hit the guy through and through. His gaze looked as focused as possible. He looked at the spear and decided that if it was an ability from his dreams, he could dodge it. When it was literally a few centimeters away from his face, it was as if a reflex went off. Sion tilted his back, thus avoiding the attack. Jae-won smiled, feeling proud of Sion. Yi-woong was surprised. He said he was very impressed and wondered if the guy was too strong. After Sion dodged the spear, he twisted in the air, flipped over and landed squatting on the wall. He started breathing heavily and tried to recover his breath. He stood up as he continued to regain his breath. Sion couldn't believe he had managed to do this. He smiled satisfied and said that with this ability, he would be able to get his dreams back. The Minotaur roared very loudly, which made Sion twitch, startled. He smiled anxiously and looked down, assuming that the monster would not give up without a fight. Jae-won smiled and said that Sion had bought them time. The guy looked down and saw that the Minotaur was raising another spear, preparing to attack. Jae-won smirked contentedly and said it was his turn now. Small lightning bolts hovered and glowed around him. He pressed a button on the handle of the umbrella, which made an activation sound. Then a small glass flask with a golden lid came out from there. The device was 100% charged. A purple core appeared in this flask and began to spin rapidly, glowing and emitting current. Jae-won started walking confidently straight towards the Minotaur, which was already ready to attack them again, where it tried to call out Yi-woong. A group of players were watching them. Yi-woong furrowed his eyebrows and said that if they didn't touch him, he would leave and asked if the Minotaur was resistant to electricity. A droplet of cold sweat ran down his face. Sion looked down where the battle was about to start in a matter of seconds and said that Jae-won's electricity didn't work last time and he wondered what he would do this time. Jae-won confidently raised his weapon upwards from where the current continued to flow. The guy asked how he could let it go. He told Yi-woong that even if he had a brain as small as a worm, He must realize that the mission must be accomplished. From his weapon appeared a long, electric beam that reached the sky. He stood directly in front of his enemy without fear, and said that he had not waited so long if he could not defeat him. The Minotaur launched an attack, and Jaiwan said that if it was resistant to electricity, he would just cut it down. He aimed his beam towards the Minotaur. He melted the Minotaur's spear in half, and then attacked the Minotaur by applying the electric spear ability. Xian was surprised to note that he had defeated it with a single strike, while Yi Wung waited with round eyes to see what would happen next. The Minotaur dropped dead, shaking the ground. The monster had been defeated. The girl with green hair first assumed that Jaiwan's weapon was plasma, but then she realized that it was like he was changing the density of electricity. The girl with long hair asked in a quiet voice if spears were supposed to stab rather than cut. She said that was only possible because they were in a cube. Jaiwan's beam no longer looked like a laser sword now, but like a lasso that wriggled. He pressed the button on the hilt when it had 82% on it, then his device turned off with 75%. He looked down at it, feeling confident. Jaiwan pushed himself off the ground, after which he jumped onto the Minotaur's iron noodle. He approached the green sphere that was in the monster's right eye socket. The first Minotaur had a yellow sphere instead of an eye, and this one had a green one, and Jaiwan wondered if those colors had a meaning. He touched the glowing sphere, and then it began to shrink to the size of a small ball that could fit in the palm of his hand. Xian jumped off the wall, leaping first onto a pile of rocks before leaping towards the players. He landed neatly not far from his comrades. Jaiwan handed him an orb that shimmered beautifully in the sun. He smiled at him and said in a friendly manner that he just wanted to help him, but it ended up looking like he had stolen the orb from him. Xian with rounded eyes asked in surprise if he was giving it back to him. His face looked both excited and pensive at the same time. He took another glance at the sphere. Jaiwan tore him away from his thoughts and said that he used his item but because of him it didn't work, and with his speed, just using the weapon, he was able to easily kill that monster. Xian raised his gaze to him and asked about the item in surprise. Jaiwan asked if he hadn't pulled it out recently and said that he honestly didn't see what it was in as he realized it was just too small. Xian lowered his head and replied that the system window said that he had equipped the blood root, but the item didn't appear. Jaiwan questioned him in surprise and replied that if the system said he had equipped it, then it definitely should have been equipped. Xian frustratedly said that he tried to find the place where he was equipped, but he ended up finding nothing. He even thought about him being invisible or something. Jaiwan covered his eyes, put his fist to his chin and started thinking. He pondered whether an object could be invisible. After a while, Jaiwan told him that objects were objects that contained special powers, and they usually had a shape. As an example, he gave his umbrella, whose handle could emit electricity. Jaiwan lowered his gaze slightly. His face was calm. He thought that based on everything he had heard, he could tell that Xian had equipped a formless item called Blood Root. He smiled understandingly, put his hand on his comrade's shoulder and said that this was the first time he had encountered something like this, so he would ask knowledgeable people about it. He said that the most important thing right now was not to get upset, and he was sure that his subject was properly equipped. Xian smiled at him and agreed with him. Yi Wung enthusiastically ran up to Xian and asked why he never told them that he had such a cool innate ability. Xian didn't understand what he was talking about and said that he understood what items were, but he hadn't heard of innate abilities. Yi Wung didn't take his words seriously and told him not to lie to him, then asked what kind of ability he had. The girl with short green hair smiled slightly. She turned to them and said that the guy wasn't lying and he really didn't know about it. These words surprised the guys.